Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I'm never ever getting married, I piped, as I watched the deluge of rain splashing against the windscreen, the raindrops rolling down the glass, that were rhythmically wiped away by the wipers. In an odd, reassuring way, it really was comforting watching this repetitive motion over and over again. My mother glanced at me with a wistful, introspective look on her face as she drove our family truck down some of Seattle's very wet roads on an evening when the traffic congestion was rife. There was bumper-to-bumper traffic, horns being blown by annoyed drivers, a general feeling of frustration caused by the gridlock of traffic. People were tired, frustrated after a hard day's work at the office, eager to get home, so invariably the backlog of accumulating traffic was most certainly not appreciated. I hope I didn't hear you right, Lucinda. Why on earth would you make such a decision like that? You're only 12 years old, for goodness sake. I'm looking forward to having grandbabies in the future. You wouldn't deprive me of that, would you? I'm not sure, Mum, that I can. I don't think I could live in a household of tears again, raised voices, petty squabbles, arguments. I don't want a life like that. I can't hack the idea of living in a hostile environment fraught with strife. It would do my head in. I thrive on peace, tranquility, security. I think I'm rather like a leopard. I like my own company. I'm solitary, keep myself to myself. That's the way I like it. It's always been that way for me. Oh, darling, that makes me so sad, so desperately sad. I can't believe me and your father have done this to you. My mother gripped the steering wheel tightly. I could see her eyes were misting over with regretful tears. My words had hit her hard like a knife to the guts. I hadn't meant to hurt her like this. I think she was secretly chastising herself for having played some part in making me so cynical about marriage. This traffic, said my mother, it's absolutely atrocious. When is it going to start moving, she said, almost grinding her teeth in annoyance. We could see a policeman wearing a yellow raincoat moving through the long line of stationary cars, occasionally stopping to talk to people through their windows, or clearly asking the officer exactly the same question. What's going on? Finally, he tapped on our windscreen. My mother wound down the window. Everything all right, madam? It would be if I could get home, officer. Why the standstill, officer? What's causing this dreadful chaos on the roads? I've never known it as bad as this. Won't be long now, madam. There's a fatal accident further up the highway, I'm afraid. A motorbike, a truck, a large tree. Before long, we drove our car past the scene of carnage. I could see the lights of a stationary ambulance still flashing, while two bodies covered in sheets were being carried in gurneys into the back of the ambulance. I could see a crumpled motorbike lying on the edge of the road, along with a mangled car, the front part crushed, buckled, disfigured and squashed up against a large tree. A scene of slaughter that spoke of catastrophe, devastation and loss. Tragic, tragic loss. It was in that moment I was hit with an epiphany. Life was short, and you could be here today, gone tomorrow. Seeing this accident confirmed these thoughts to me. Only an hour ago those two people were alive and kicking. Now they were being whisked off to the mortuary. What a dreadful, obscene loss of life. That was when I began to reflect on how many pointless days, hours, years and weeks my parents had fought like a belligerent pair of Rottweilers, day in and day out, until finally one day they realised that perhaps they shouldn't live together after all. It took them years to reach this very sensible conclusion. Even our next-door neighbour had been wiser and seen more sense when she rehomed one of her dogs that was being tirelessly bullied by her bull terrier. It would seem after my parents' divorce, life had become serene, peaceful, blissful even. The heavy energy in our home had completely lifted. I felt as if I could breathe again. So yes, I will admit, my view of marriage was permanently marred, scarred by my negative experiences in the matter. It was one day in the summer of 1984 that I was driving my truck down a dirt road, not too far from the towns of Cedro and Woolley, which are situated on the western edge of the majestic Cascade mountain range, north of Seattle, south of Bellingham, on Highway 20, along the banks of the Skagit River. I do remember the road was very remote, rugged, off the beaten track, so there was no passing traffic in sight. I was a wildlife veterinarian at the time. One of my clients had literally begged me to go and visit a friend of hers who had a horse struggling with colic. I was on my way back from treating the animal in question and advising the client on the treatment protocol that she obviously needed to follow, when I came unstuck in a way I would never have envisaged possible. In a trice I heard a thump, then a vibration, along with a loud flapping noise. I groaned. I knew my tyre had hit something precariously sharp in the road, like a nail or a piece of glass. It was now flat. By reasonable assumption, driving on a flat tyre is asking for an accident to happen, so I clearly could not proceed further along my way. I stopped my truck, groaning. In those days we didn't have the advantages of cell phones, so I knew I was in a dreadful pickle. I was pretty much stuck in the middle of nowhere, with no help in sight whatsoever. I climbed out of my car, not feeling terribly confident about changing a tyre. It was something I'd never attempted to do before, but I really had no choice in the matter, or I was likely stuck here for a very long time, until I chanced upon some much-needed help. Unfortunately, despite my very best efforts, I was unable to loosen the lug nuts with my wrench. I do not know how long I was struggling before a truck stopped behind my vehicle. I breathed a huge sigh of relief. Help had arrived for me at last. A young man stepped out of his vehicle. He came ambling towards me, wearing a debonair cowboy hat, denims and cowboy boots. "Need any help?" came a deep, gravelly voice. I looked up to find myself staring into the steely blue eyes of a quintessential no-nonsense American cowboy. "I'm having a little difficulty changing my tyre, that's all." "I can see that." The man bent beside my tyre with the wrench and effortlessly removed the lug nuts, as if they were merely hairpins, and within seconds he had removed my tyre, generously replacing it for me with the spare. He grinned at me. "Now, that wasn't so hard, was it?" "Don't look so smug," I said, feeling myself flushing with embarrassment. "You made it look easy, but I can assure you it was anything but." "Oh, but it was easy. Very easy," he teased. "Maybe for you it was, but there's no need to look so pleased with yourself about it. I can assure you I'm no damsel in distress. If that's what you're thinking, I'm perfectly capable of changing a tyre. It was those lug nuts. They were just so tight." "If you say so," said the man, looking rather amused. "You remind me of one of my horses." He grinned. "Starfire's the name. She's a spirited creature like you. It took me longer than most to break her in, but in the end she was eating out of my hands." "What are you insinuating? You think you could break me in, is that it? You think I'm like one of your horses? I've heard everything now." "I could break you in as easy as pie," he said, giving me a big wink, his eyes twinkling. "You really do have a high opinion of yourself, don't you?" I said. "Now, thanks for your help, but I need to be making tracks now." The man raised a brow. He looked disappointed. "Not so fast. You mean to say you're not going to buy me a drink? Isn't that the very least you could do in the circumstances? I've only just fixed your tyre for you. If it weren't for me, you would be stuck here all night. And as for making tracks, you would be going nowhere fast if I hadn't quickly come to your aid. All right, I'll buy you a drink in Cedro, but then I have to make tracks. I have a cat at home that needs feeding. She gets very grumpy if her plate is empty. Your grumpy cat sounds a lot like me when I haven't eaten, and I'm beginning to feel rather hungry. I think eating sounds like a good idea. Forget the drink. Join me for dinner, to repay me for my gallant kindness, of course. It wasn't long before I was seated in a restaurant with this handsome stranger, whom I remember thinking was rather cocky and sure of himself, so I didn't like him one little bit. I always despised arrogant men. In truth, he was the most pig-headed man I'd ever met, with a humongous ego on him the size of Seattle, or possibly bigger. So what were you doing with a flat tyre on a remote dirt road? You could have been out there all night if I hadn't come along to rescue the poor princess in jeopardy. You really fancy yourself as some kind of knight in shining armour, don't you? You can forget that. Don't get any ideas. I'm not interested, I assure you. I never will be. Just so that you know. Is that some kind of a challenge, lady? Because if it is, I'm very game indeed. I've always been a successful betting man. I guarantee you one thing, lady. After 10 dates with me, you will be practically begging me to marry you. That's a fact. Are you kidding me? You think I'm going to beg to marry you after 8 dates? Or 10 dates, whatever you were saying. I mean, does that even happen? You really are the most obnoxious, appalling man I've ever met. I tell you what, you're on, I said defiantly. I was determined to show this man that if he thought he could charm the cotton socks of most women, it wasn't going to work on me, and I was not most women. I'm only agreeing to this crazy notion just to wipe that grin off your face. I'll go on 10 dates with you, just to prove to you that you're not as irresistible as you clearly think you are. Just to make a point, and that's it. Good, he said, smirking. Just so you know, I managed to break in Starfire sooner than most. The average horse takes about 4 to 6 weeks to break in. I broke in that wild horse within 8 days. No one else could do it, but I did. No one believed it could be done. She was one of the most difficult, tumultuous horses I've ever met. Stubborn, opinionated, feisty. I overcame the odds with her, much like I shall with you. First of all, I'd like to get one thing straight. I'm not one of your horses. Second, you'll never ever break me in. Get it? If you thought Starfire was difficult, you ain't seen anything yet. The man's lips twitched with amusement. We'll see, he chuckled. I'll say one thing to you. You will be begging me to marry you in 10 days. Against all the incredulous odds, it would seem that I was the one with egg on my face, as after the 8th date, I kid you not, the girl who'd sworn blind 1,000 times over to her mother that she would never ever get married, found herself agreeing to marrying this exasperating, self-assured man. But one thing to my credit is I didn't beg him to marry me. I admit he popped the question, and I just couldn't say no. He said it was the same thing. He'd won the bet. I wish I could have turned him down, but this man had me weak at the knees, much like everything else in his life that had surrendered to his charm, like the cattle on his ranch, his dogs, along with all his horses. It would seem that I was cast under his alluring spell. After we were married, I adapted to ranch life seamlessly. Before long, we had 3 boys running around the place like little terrorists, playing with their water pistols, and genuinely becoming as annoying as humanly possible. But life was so good. Very, very good. My mother had been absolutely right. Not all marriages are created equal. As my home was filled with a plethora of warmth, laughter, and an abundance of love, something I myself had not grown up with in my early years. I had decided to become a fully fledged ranch wife, but I had the distinct advantage of being able to use my veterinary skills to manage our large cattle herd, and of course the horses on our vast sprawling acreage of land. It wasn't long before I was rescuing all kinds of animals, from raccoons to foxes, squirrels, waterfowls, birds and deer, as so many locals in the area would often bring wild animals to me that had been abandoned or had fallen victim to being hit by a car. It was my passion to help animals in distress, finally returning them back to the wild. I had achieved my aims with a measure of success, but one day something quite extraordinary happened that was to become one of the greatest highlights of my life. A 23-year-old girl I knew called Aviana visited me on my ranch. She phoned me to tell me she had found a strange creature that needed my attention, but she couldn't fathom what it was. But it looked like it was half ape and half human, she told me. I must admit I was rather intrigued, but I thought Aviana must have been exaggerating, but it turned out she was not. Even in the early stages of development, the tiny little infant already had a large pyramid-shaped head, with a powerful sagral crest. That's where the jaw muscles go up and down. I know that it is exceedingly strong in mountain gorillas, so that they don't end up crushing their own brain with their powerful muscles. Even as a youngling, the chest on the torso was remarkably sizable in relation to its body size. It also possessed broad hands and feet, and a very dark leathery face with large aquatic nostrils and deep-set dark eyes. I know it may sound like I am intrinsically describing an ape, but this is not so. It was incredulous how remarkably human this creature actually was. To put it in simple terminology, if you have a chocolate and cinnamon cake, it's still a chocolate cake, but it has a cinnamon twist. It was very much like this for the baby. It attained ape-like influences, or twists if you like, but it was still profoundly human. I could see the baby was in serious trouble and distress, as it was not responding to us in any way. Its silken hair was wet and clammy, its eyes almost glazed over like a dead fish, although of course I could see it was alive. "Where did you find this baby, Aviana?" "Well, I was taking Mitzi, my little Jack Russell, for a walk in the woods. She darted over to this large tree, began to bark and bark. Mitzi never normally behaves in such a strange way, so I knew something was clearly bothering her a great deal. But I looked around the tree and could see nothing that really got my immediate attention. Well, not at first, as nothing untoward stood out to me. 'Mitzi,' I piped, 'there's nothing there. Let's go.' But that was when I heard a very low groaning, snorting sound, so I studied every inch of that tree as intensely as I could. That was when I saw the sizable obscure basket tied to the tree. Something was moving inside of it, but I didn't know what it was. I would have walked away and ignored it normally, as I really don't like disturbing wildlife of any kind. But this was not a bird's nest, it was a basket that had been weaved superbly into some kind of baby's crib. Something made me take a second look. I looked inside to see this baby in there, this one here, but I knew something was wrong with it. The eyes didn't look right. They were staring vacantly. The baby also seemed so hot. Well done for bringing it here. You may just have saved its life. Do you think the mother knows its baby is sick, Mrs. Villarreal? Not necessarily. Some viral infections and fevers can come on very quickly and fast. She may have left her baby in the basket for a while and decided to go searching for food, none the wiser as to the precarious condition of her youngling. That could easily have happened. I'm just worried about the mother, Mrs. Villarreal. She must be so worried to discover that the basket is now empty. It really would be like a bona fide abduction to the creature, discovering her baby vanished off the face of the earth, wondering who had possibly taken it. I can't imagine how I would feel if I was the one wearing her shoes. Well, it's better than discovering her baby dead, I said. I attached the baby to an IV drip, administering some antiviral medications. We're saving the youngling. If you hadn't discovered it in time, I guarantee you of this, Aviana, it would almost certainly have died. You saved the creature's life. Does it have a fighting chance, Mrs. Villarreal, in surviving, I mean? Of course it does. More than a fair chance, I'd say. This little wee thing has a robust constitution, probably better than ours. I'm sure it'll pull through very nicely, but then only time will tell. What is it, Mrs. Valarial? Because it's not completely human, is it? Have you ever heard of the abominable snowman, Aviana? Who hasn't? You don't think... She looked at me, her shining brown eyes growing as wide as saucers. Are you kidding, Mrs. Valarial? You really think that this is an abominable snowman youngling? I can't believe it. Are you being serious? Well, yes, as a matter of fact, I am. But my advice to you, Aviana, is to keep this to yourself for the well-being of the animal. If you were to tell anyone about this, who knows where it would lead? I dread to think. This gorgeous little mite deserves to have a full and whole future. We can't jeopardise that for him. Imagine if the press were to find out about the poor little mite. They'd have a field day, let me tell you. Can you envisage the newspaper headlines? Young girl finds abominable snowman intact in woven basket on tree. I can guarantee you this, Aviana. Some kind of scientific authority, in the guise of cryptozoology research, will claim the rights to take this little infant away, prodding it within an inch of its life. Oh, how awful, gasped Aviana. Do you really think that would happen, Mrs. Valarial? Think it? I pretty much guarantee it, Aviana. I'm sure you agree. This little mite deserves to be with its mother, back in the natural world. I wouldn't have it any other way, Mrs. Valarial. But what are we going to do if the baby gets a lot better, and then we can't locate its mother? Oh, I think we'll be able to locate its mother. You do? But how can you be so sure? Because, Aviana, I'm a mother myself, with 3 young brats of my own. If one of them went missing from a Pacific area, you can bet your bottom dollar, for days, weeks, months, even years on end, I'd still go back to the scene of the crime, to search the area all over again, no matter how fruitless it might seem. A mother's love. Well, let's just say there's nothing like it. One day when you have children of your own, you will completely understand what I'm talking about. I'm glad to say that within hours, that little youngling was beginning to respond to my medications. And within 48 hours, let's just say that he had made remarkable progress. This was a kind of virus that would make a human baby sick for about 1 to 2 weeks, but on the 4th day this little baby was fighting fit. It was looking at me with these bright, sparkling, deep-set eyes, watching my every move curiously, following me around with its eyes. It was such an affectionate creature. I would jiggle it up and down on my hips. It would play with my long hair with its overlong arms. Me and my husband would sit with the baby on the wraparound porch of our farmhouse. It interacted with us with such an intelligence. It pulled my husband's cowboy hat off his head and began to examine the inside of the hat curiously. My husband also tickled its belly, and it began to laugh just like a human being. "Don't give me a look like that," said my husband to me. "What look? What you talking about?" "That look that says, 'Let's keep the youngling because it's so cute. I couldn't bear to part with it.' Of course I want to keep it, with all my heart. But then there's a mother out there, grieving the loss of her baby. I can't imagine what she's going through. We have to return it to her." "My thoughts exactly. You think the creature is strong enough now to return to its mother?" "Yes, I do. And the sooner the better." The next day I drove my truck to Aviana. Aviana was naturally astonished by how much progress the creature had made over a couple of days, and of course how healthy it had become. It was hard not to fall completely head over heels in love with the creature, because it was so loving, affectionate, funny, curious, responsive, intelligent, and the best mime artist you've ever seen, so good at imitating everything we did. "I can't believe how intelligent he is," she said, as the creature's overlong arms began to tug at her hair affectionately when she held it lovingly in her arms, and stroked its long silky coat, that even over a couple of days had grown significantly thicker. "A human baby, Mrs. Valaria, would never be as sharp as this. True, but remember this creature has to grow up in the wild fast, so it certainly needs a certain amount of alertness to survive the challenges of the wild. Well, I suppose that makes lots of sense." Aviana's parents' farm was flanked by a sprawling area of natural woodland that sprawled over a vast acreage where she regularly took Mitzi for his daily walk. "Do you think you can remember whereabouts you found the baby?" I asked her. "Of course. How could I ever forget such a place? It's a very beguiling spot, overlooking the stream that meanders through the valley. Most of the statuesque trees in these woods are ponderosa pines, but this is one of the river birch trees, and this one is particularly large. Most river birch trees are small in size, but this one is huge, possibly because it's close to the water. That was where I found the basket tied to the tree. I imagine it's still there. Good. It would be good to find it. Do you really think we'll find the mother, Mrs. Valarial? I mean, abominable snowmen are very elusive. Are you still confident that we'll see her? I don't know, I said. Just like I told you last time, it's a mother's hunch, an intuition if you like. We walked through the towering ponderosa pine trees that were clustered together like tall ballet dancers, reaching up into the cobalt sky with such a masterful elegance and grace, while the prisms of sunlight pinwheeled through the trees, bespeckling the floor with an ethereal phosphorescence. I was wearing one of my children's old baby slings, so that the cute little baby was now attached to my front side. We trudged awkwardly through the thick ground cover, which included viridescent ferns, mosses, herbs and creeping foliages, until we reached the trickling stream. We moved towards the river birch trees, and that was when Aviana froze. She pointed towards a large river birch tree, with its graceful outstretched branches cascading over the water's edge, rather reminding me of a weeping willow. "Over there," she whispered. "I think that's the mother. It must be her. I'm sure of it." "Where?" I asked. "I can't see her." "Over there, look. Can't you see? To the right." "Oh, yes." At first my eyes could only discern the foaming white bubbles of the crystal clear water, crashing, beating, thrashing against the rocky boulders with a feisty force as it hurried along its determined course through the valley. But sitting there on a smooth rocky outcrop, overlooking the babbling stream, was a tall solitary figure, covered with long flowing dark hair, with the straightest back that I have ever discerned before. But despite her graceful deportment, I could feel that by contrast her depleted energy was slouched, slumped, drooping over, much like the graceful branches of the river birch tree draping over the stream, as if every bone within her powerful body was crumbling, folding, heaving, under the hefty weightiness of her emotional despair that ebbed through her heart, that had drained her joy like a blood-sucking leech. This ambiguous creature had gathered a large pile of stones together that were placed by her side. She was randomly throwing them into the water with her overlong arms, rather like a penny in the Trevi fountain in Rome, as if every single stone she threw into the water that went plunging into the murky depths represented a wish in her heart. If you were to see her sitting on a sidewalk on a street in Seattle, you would instinctively feel the creature's pain, for it hung in the air like the bold, brash, impertinent tinsel on a Christmas tree that could not be overlooked. It was such an outspoken, poignant, sad energy that my eyes misted over with moisture, while a couple of stray tears glistened on my eyelashes, clinging to them tightly like opaque raindrops. I don't know why I've never really considered that the mother of this youngling might indeed just be the most intimidating creature in the entire universe. In truth, that idea had never even crossed my mind. I'd been so excited to return the youngling to its mother that I hadn't even perceived any risk factors that might be involved in attempting such an arduous, intrepid mission. But now that I was standing in the woods, only a few feet behind the creature, I was having serious reservations, for the size of her from the back view, sitting down, was scarily large. Imagine how huge she would be if she was to stand up straight. I literally dreaded to think. It was clear, even from the back view, that this creature was an apex predator. You would have expected her to notice us at once. Maybe she already knew we were there, but she didn't care. Her pain had sapped her normally sharp instincts. Ariana whispered to me, "She's so huge. Let's just put the baby down and get the heck out of here." Just from her back view, my knees are virtually buckling beneath me from my nerves. We don't know how she could react to us. She could be dangerous, exceedingly dangerous, aggressive even. It was hard to believe that anything connected to this adorable, cute little youngling that had fallen fast asleep in my arms against the warmth of my chest could be anything but amenable towards us. But look at bear cubs, They can be desperately cute, but when they become adults, it's a whole different story. Could this be a similar scenario, I wondered? It was lightly, very lightly. All of a sudden the creature turned around to look directly at us. In that moment my heart literally jumped in my throat. I need not have worried, for she regarded us with an air of indifference, as if she had no interest in us, and did not particularly care whether we were around or not. It seemed her naturally evasive nature had been hijacked by her hopeless despondency. It was in that serendipitous second the baby woke up. It began to make happy chuckling sounds, as its overlong arm began to tug at my hair. In that second the mother's pyramid-shaped head swiveled around to look in our direction, for she had recognized that sound. But could she dare to hope? Could she, that this was her youngling? Her deep-set dark eyes homed in on me, with a tunnel vision, hovering curiously over the strange bundle attached to my middle. The expression on her face had changed from sadness into hope in just a second. In that poignant moment she raised herself off the ground with such grace, towering at about 7 foot tall, covered in long flowing dark hair that was thick, silky, shiny. Her large breasts were full, her legs and arms long and lean, her upper body strong, muscular, powerful, while her dark leathery face was remarkably human. She moved towards me, her steps gliding with a level of uncertainty. Once again the little baby let out a chuckling noise and began pulling off the cap that I was wearing on my head. Now there wasn't even a lingering shadow of doubt any more. The mother recognized the distinguished tone of her infant's voice. The hope in her heart was now evacuated as jubilation, triumph, ebullience furnished her mind with a steadfast certainty. The mother stood yards away from me. She was watching me excitedly as I unleashed the buckle on the baby's sling. Then I lifted the baby out of the sling, moving deliberately towards her, holding out the baby in my outstretched arms. I've never seen a creature look so overwhelmed with an incredible joy. The creature looked at me with such a thankfulness, as if I was an angel from heaven, having opened the clouds to return her baby, an answer to her desperate prayers. She took her youngling from me, clasping it in her overlong arms, with such an expression of euphoria on her face that I found myself beginning to sob as the tears began to pour down my face, choking me up. I realized that Aviana was as bad as I was, as she too was crying gleeful tears, rejoicing in this mother's abounding happiness. The effervescent mother began to bob her youngling up and down in her arms. She stood still for a moment, holding my gaze. We locked eyes together. I could hear her say in my heart, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." I watched as she carried the kid away, moving into the forest with it in her arms, glancing back at us with the warmest, bright, thankful eyes I've ever seen. Then she glided away, and when she moved, it looked like she floated. Her movements were so fluid, so graceful, so agile, so beautiful. When she was gone, Aviana and I embraced. "This is the best day of my life," she told me. "Better than any Christmas, birthday or anything." "I agree," I said. "This is one of the best days of my life too. Much like the day I married my wonderful husband. Giving birth to my children was also a very poignant day of my life. But this day, I can never forget it. The day when we reunited the abominable snowman, or Bigfoot baby if you like, with its mother. It doesn't get better than that. So there you are. That's my story. Oh my word, I'm crying. I'm literally crying reading that. It's just moved my heart. I'm literally crying. So please, that was just such a gorgeous story. Anyway, until next time, goodbye and good night. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my dreams lay shattered, splintered, fractured around me, scattered precariously like the glass fragments from a broken mirror into hundreds of tiny smithereens. I knew that I would never be the same ever again, as my devastating skiing accident had caused me to go flying into a tree at a grueling, harrowing high impact that would almost certainly cause catastrophic damage to my right leg that could never be corrected or righted again. I would perpetually have to live with this unfortunate encumbrance all of my life, walking around with a limp, being subjected to bouts of unreasonable shooting pain that would make me invariably grit my teeth from the agony. In truth, it was a complete miracle I was actually alive. I had hit the tree with such a powerful brute force. I had to be grateful for small mercies, however obscure or faint they actually may be. I can remember drifting in and out of consciousness after the horrifying ordeal. I also recall feeling a strange kind of suction, followed by a popping, rather like a cork being pulled out of a bottle of champagne, after which I found myself hovering above my body, looking down at a crumbled, distorted form that lay underneath the tree. I discovered to my immense surprise that this bedraggled, crumpled bundle was actually me. I felt strangely disconnected, indifferent, and rather detached from my own physical body. I could hear the frenzied, terrified cries of people shouting, "Oh my God! We're losing him! Do something! We're losing him!" I do not remember anything else after that, until one day I woke up in my hospital bed, connected to all kinds of tubes. I was informed that my now withered leg was a physical disability or impediment in my life that would require a significant amount of pain management. Indeed, amputation had been on the cards, a viable option that had been seriously contemplated. Ostensibly, my surgeon had decided against it, and that my leg should be spared. It was well worth saving, he thought. On occasion I would regret that decision, as the pain that I was to experience in the years that followed was sometimes quite unbearable, unrelenting, and vicious. But I had learnt to live with it, rather like a surfer moving with the waves on his surfboard, going with the flow of the ocean. I was to wake up in a hospital bed, heavily bandaged, with plasters on every available appendage, from the plethora of brutal breaks I'd sustained. I felt so disorientated and confused at first, I didn't actually know where I was, as solicitous nurses and doctors hovered around me like buzzing bees over a hive. "How are we today, Griffin? It's Griffin Holmes, am I right?" came a deep, gravelly voice. "I'm Dr. Wallace Fortescue." "I'm Griffin Holmes, that's right, Doctor. I suppose I'm doing all right, but I am experiencing a lot of shooting pain, uncomfortable spasms, especially in my right leg here." "Well, that is to be expected, Mr. Holmes, but we manage it with pain medications for you, and anti-inflammatories. You're a very lucky man indeed to be alive. For a moment it was touch and go there. We almost lost you a handful of times, I regret to say. In truth, we didn't think you would make it, but it seems you're a fighting man in more ways than one. The rare kind that always gives us hope here at the hospital. By all accounts, I'm very glad to say that you didn't sever your spine. Things could have panned out a lot worse for you. A whole lot worse. But I am going to make a full recovery, am I not, Doc? I'm going to be able to continue my job as a firefighter, am I not? Not in a physical capacity, no. I'm afraid not, Mr. Holmes. Please call me Griffin, Doctor." "Griffin," said the doctor, clearing his throat awkwardly. "As I was saying, your right leg is seriously impaired. I hate to be the bearer of bad tidings, but I need to be perfectly straight with you. That is the way I always am with my patients. The long-term prognosis for you is very bleak in regards to your leg. Your leg was badly shattered. Never seen anything like it in my life. It was almost unsalvageable. It certainly will disqualify you from active duty in the fire brigade." At this horrifying revelation, my heart sank like a heavy stone, sinking, plummeting, diving to the bottom of a lake, along with all my hopes and dreams. "But, Doc, you don't understand. Firefighting is my life. It's all I've ever wanted to do since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. I'm an active man, always loved sports, outdoor adventures. Are you saying it's all over for me, Doc? Because if you are, you might as well be signing my death certificate right now." "I know it sounds grim, Griffin. I admit that some of your outdoor activities you once pursued, like skiing, are things of the past. But that does not mean you cannot go out into nature, enjoy the natural world. But there are some things you're not going to be able to do anymore, with the ardent passion you previously pursued them, like skiing, running, long-distance hiking, cycling, and stuff like that. But there's no reason why you can't go hunting. I'm afraid, Doctor, you're listing all the things I love best in the world. In other words, you're telling me that my life has to become much more sedentary from now on. In a manner of speaking, yes, but your life is most certainly not over. There's so much to live for. You can pursue other interests. I've had patients wearing your shoes going on to achieve great things in their life. One man has become a fine potter. His work sells for considerable sums of money all over North America. Another has become a very successful aspiring chef. Perhaps life is drawing you down a different path. It's my belief, Griffin, from working with so many patients over the years, that nothing is ever random. Well, not as random as we may think. You may be surprised to learn that good can come out of bad, like the green grass shooting through the burnt carnage of a wildfire. If you think that's going to cheer me up, Doctor, forget it. The last thing I can envisage for my life is becoming a potter, or a cook for that matter. I've never been good with my hands. Good grief, I couldn't think of anything I would despise more. As for my cooking skills, I've been told that my eggs taste just like bullets. The doctor chuckled. Well, the good news there is, Griffin, if your eggs are like bullets, there's room for improvement. If the doctor's startling revelations were not a big enough blow for me, that day was to get progressively worse, a whole lot worse if that was at all possible. When my fiancé, Anwar Montanaro, came to visit me in hospital later on in the day, she too delivered me a great big punch in the guts. Talk about kicking a man when he's down. Was I not hurting enough in every part of my body? I knew something was up the moment Anwar entered my ward. Even the way she moved was stiff. Worse still, she was refusing to make any eye contact with me, avoiding my gaze very deliberately, like someone carrying the weight of a very guilty conscience on their shoulders, who would rather be anywhere else in the world than in the hospital ward with me. That was very clear to me. I knew she was going to unleash a bombshell that would potentially explode in my face like a landmine. I just knew it. I could feel it. The atmosphere in my hospital ward had become cold, unfriendly, clinical even. I waited with bated breath to hear what she was going to say, as if waiting for that nasty strike from a king cobra. Anwar twiddled her fingers awkwardly, playing with her long, perfectly manicured bright pink nails that were covered with a plethora of glittery designs. She studied them as though they were a great source of fascination for her, a premeditated excuse not to have to face me head-on. I watched her as she dragged her chair across the floor towards my bed, never once looking at me. But when I reached out to hold her hand in mine, she pushed it away. Griffin, we need to talk. Now, you know I'd never wish what happened to you on anyone. I really, really wouldn't. But we've got to get real here. I mean, your accident on the ski slopes, it's changed everything for us. I don't know how to say this to you, but I just don't think we should get married anymore. It wouldn't work out in the circumstances, she said, pulling off her engagement ring, placing it on my bedside table. This revelation hit me like a sledgehammer. I see, I said, my voice growing hoarse, my whole body now weighted down by a huge heaviness. Why not? Well, it's not practical, is it? Let's face it. Not any more. I mean, not with that gammy leg of yours. I'm an active person. Your condition would be a hindrance to our relationship. We couldn't do those outdoor activities together that we were planning to do. We can't climb mountains together. Stuff like that. It's a real bummer, I know, for you, but it's equally so for me. If not more so in the circumstances. I see. So my crippled leg is a very big obstacle to our relationship, I said sarcastically, digging the knife in as hard as I possibly could. After all, you couldn't be seen marrying a cripple. Now, don't be so reactive, Griffin. I'm saying it as it is. I'd only start to resent you if we couldn't do the things together we used to do. And you know I would. I wouldn't want that to happen. You need a woman who can take care of you in your present condition. A woman who's sedentary, willing to look after you. Oh, I see. So I need a nurse, do I? That's not what I'm saying. Get out, I shouted. Get out. I don't need to hear any of this. You make me sick to the stomach. Get out. Now there's no need to be like that, Griffin. You're being exceedingly unreasonable. I said, get out. Did you hear me? Get out. The nurse, who'd been in the ward, taking down some brief notes, heard our conversation. She immediately flew to my defence, like a buzzard guarding a carcass from other predators. She pounced on my fiancé with a feisty, steely grit, her eyes like treacherous blue daggers. You heard the man! Get out! Get out! Did you hear? Get out! My fiancé's olive-skinned face grew as white as a sheet. The colour drained. She gave me a hostile look, stamped her foot like a petulant schoolkid, and then marched out of the hospital belligerently, in a huff, as if she was the one that had been hard done by. I never ever saw her again, although I was to learn that her name Anwar means liar, which in the circumstances is exceedingly apt. The nurse scurried towards me, her eyes brimming with tears. She reached out to hold my hand as she pulled a chair up to my bedside, and a lone silvery tear trickled down her cheek. She squeezed my hand tightly, reassuringly, looking into my eyes with a tender gentleness so lacking in my cold-blooded fiancé. "Are you all right?" she asked. I nodded. "What a horrible woman! You must forgive me for eavesdropping, but I overheard your conversation. I couldn't help it. Frankly, I'm so disgusted, repulsed, appalled even. How dare she talk to you like that? She was your fiancé, I take it. She ends your relationship after your dreadful skiing accident. I mean, how low can you get? Talk about kicking you in the guts." "Well, she doesn't want to spend her life with a cripple, does she? I suppose I can't blame her. It would seem being married to me would seriously compromise her future happiness." "That's ridiculous. She's ridiculous. But maybe she's done you a favour in the long term." "How's that?" "Well, she's shown you the grievous state of her heart, hasn't she? How selfish, self-centred and narcissistic she is. You can see her life only revolves around herself. Stuff anybody else. If she really loved you, she would marry you, even if you were completely paralysed from the waist down. Unconditional love has no barricades, no conditions, nor fixed terms. It just is. Your fiancé, well, she doesn't even have a heart. She's spineless. She's a snake in the grass." "I think you might be right there," I said. "Maybe I did dodge a bullet." "Oh, believe me, Mr. Hughes, you most certainly did," she said, giving me an encouraging nudge. "She might come in a pretty glitzy package that appears enticing and alluring, but believe me, the chocolate in the cellophane is seriously mouldy, hideously repugnant, completely inedible." Indeed, it was true. After my accident, I saw my fiancé, or ex-fiancé if you like, in a whole different light, as if seeing her for the very first time in a crowded room, in a blinding, sententious light that was so intense I could pick up all her flaws, rather reminding me of those scary UV photographs you get that show you the true hideous state of your skin, so that every bit of evidential sun damage is discernible to you. It was like I was seeing her through another very illuminating lens, rather like the eyes of God, that can see our hearts. This time I did not see the attractive woman with the long dark hair, fair skin and green eyes, for the veneer had been shoved to the side so forcefully, rather like the drapes on a window, and I got to see what was really on the inside. Needless to say, after an arduous year of intensive physical therapy, shooting physical pain, trauma counselling, along with a significant amount of checkups, I finally received a clean bill of health from my doctor. But returning to my former life as a firefighter was never going to happen. That part had been forever expunged from me. I felt a significant amount of bitterness in my life, possibly towards my ex-fiancé among other things, along with the unfortunate blows that the universe had dealt for me. So I punnelled all my energy into my father's business. Before he retired, he handed over the reins of the company to me, so I became the big boss, calling all the shots. The business in Los Angeles prospered, bearing an abundance of fruit, but I was very different, like an old dying tree. I'd lost the ardent passion and zealousness for life. Happiness eluded me, like a balloon on a string, floating into the azure blue sky. The string too far to reach. Little did I realise that I'd wrapped myself in a cocoon of self-preservation to protect myself from being hurt again. I had earned a formidable reputation at work as being a man of steel with a cold heart. It would seem that I would not let anyone into my soft personal space for fear of being hurt again. One day a great friend of mine who was a firefighter called me up on the spot, encouraging me to go camping with him in an area of wilderness in Northern California. "I haven't seen you for so long, Griffin, since we worked together 10 years ago. My, hasn't time flown by so fast, bro. We do need to reconnect. It's been far too long. I've rarely missed you." "It has been long," I agreed. "You won't have to go hiking on foot," he explained. "We'll go camping on horseback, so it's unlikely to be a problem for your leg. Go on, it'll do you good. Please, please say yes. I'm looking so forward to seeing you again." I didn't hesitate to say yes, as the very idea of camping in the wilderness was exceedingly appealing for me. It had been too long since my feet had padded the rich earthen trails of a verdant forest, and breathed in the fresh, crisp air of the mountains, or tasted the crisp, fresh water of a sparkling stream. The memories of those soulful experiences and others like them came flooding back to my mind, like a nostalgic fragrance I had not smelt for a very long time, like freshly mown grass, jasmine, or the smell of a pine forest. Stanley Finch was a man of few words, but when he spoke his mind, he wore his heart on his sleeve. "You've changed, bro," he said to me. "After your accident, something has died in you. That bright spark has all but faded." He informed me of this on the first night of our camping trip. We were relaxing by a fire pit outside of our tent, after having eaten some delicious barbecue ribs and pork tenderloin. "I've missed you, Griffin, but I can see life hasn't been good to you. You've become bitter, hard, cold. I know your ex-fiancé hurt you, as did the skiing accident, but there is no need to cover yourself in a protective bubble like this, or live in fear with such cynicism. That's not the Griffin I used to know. The old Griffin was fearless, passionate, enthusiastic, zealous. I'm not the man I once was," I admitted. "I'm a shadow of my former self. It doesn't help that I live in pain." Stanley looked at me in shock, his blue eyes registering concern. "I'm sorry, bro. I had no idea it was that bad. I hope your ride on Silver Birch this morning did not jolt you or exacerbate any old injuries. You must tell me if your leg is hurting." Funny enough, the ride was pleasantly smooth, I assured him. "My leg pain is incongruous. I might be fine for a couple of days, and then suddenly, when I'm dictating a letter to my secretary, I'll be hit with these violent shooting spasms. I've learnt to live with the pain, manage it somehow." "That's terrible, bro. I'm sorry." He paused for a moment and said, "What about women? Are there any significant others in your life?" "Oh, that," I pooh-poohed, trying my level best to avoid such a direct, uncomfortable, confrontational question that I also didn't want to confront. "I've not had time to date. I'm too busy, I expect, involved in running my father's company. Business is good, very good." "But you're not, are you?" asked Stanley, looking at me fixedly. "It sounds to me as if running a successful company is a great source of distraction for you, so that you're far too busy to have a life beyond the office. You know what I think? I think you're scared to date." He said that looking at me sadly. "That bloody narcissistic ex-fiancé of yours obliterated all your confidence. I promise you, bro, take it from me, not all women are cast from the same mould. There are good ones out there. I promise, as hard as that is to believe. I'm not sure most women want to date a cripple." "Don't be ridiculous, Griffin. You've got a dodgy leg, for goodness sake. And even if you were crippled, why should that be a setback for you in finding a good woman? Do you remember Ralph Batterskew?" "I do. Very nice character." "Well, he ended up paralysed from the waist down from an injury when he was rescuing a young girl from a burning building. Moments after he saved her life, the scaffolding on the second floor collapsed. He sustained one heck of a nasty fall, poor man. Oh, I am sorry to hear that, I said. That does sound frightful. Well, he got married last year. He has a wife and is very much in love. You could do the same, Griffin. Open your heart to a good woman. You don't want to be alone for the rest of your life, surely. You make a good point, Stanley. I'll think about it, I said. Please do, bro. You deserve to be very happy. But more to the point, I want you to be happy. I want to see the old spark return in your eyes. I do have an alternative motive for bringing you here, I have to confess, he said, grinning at me. You do, I asked, looking perturbed. I groaned. Oh, no. You haven't gone and set me up with an absurd date, have you? I hope you haven't. Of course not. Let me explain. There was a wildfire not far from here, which took us days to extinguish. It was quite an inferno, a nightmare to control, let me tell you. One of the firefighters, Keith, claimed to have seen 2 Bigfoot running away from the location of the wildfire. I took it upon myself to examine the rural geography of the area. In my opinion, we're both camping in the heart of Bigfoot territory. I'm pretty certain the Bigfoots would have relocated to this spot, after the wildfire, that is, given the topography of the area, the close access to fresh water and food sources. At Stanley's earnest expression, along with the excited glaze in his eyes, I couldn't stop myself from laughing. You brought me here in the hope we might encounter a Bigfoot. Now that's borderline insane, bro. That's exactly why I brought you here, said Stanley, grinning. It's not just Keith that had a sighting of a Bigfoot. A few of the other dudes I work with had fleeting glances of the creature at various other wildfire locations. But never ever me. Can you believe it? Never me. The very one that wants a sighting more than anyone else. Well, it completely eludes me. I mean, how unfortunate do you have to get? I grinned. Maybe you're looking too hard, I teased. Stanley's expression was serious as his eyes meditated on the flames in the fire pit. It's something I've always wanted, he said longingly. An encounter with the hairy man himself. I'm not exactly sure why. I can't even fathom this enigmatic longing that I have. But why? I asked. From what I gather, not all encounters are benevolent. You run the risk of encountering a belligerent territorial Bigfoot who could potentially be quite dangerous. Believe me, I've heard stories, scary stories, that I shall not repeat to you. That's a risk I'm willing to take. I'm of the opinion that these creatures are as individualistic as human beings. Look at the one in the picture taken at Bluff Creek all those long years ago. Anyone could see that that was not an aggressive critter. The poor thing, she couldn't get away fast enough. I almost felt sorry for her. She clearly wasn't thrilled to have been spotted. I can't say I blame her. So you decided to bring along your friend with a gammy leg for a Bigfoot adventure. Is that right? I teased. Why not? I certainly don't see you as a cripple. And even if I did, I'd still invite you. You've always been open to a good adventure. And Bigfoot, dude, it ain't going to get better than that. You do realise, Stanley, that Bigfoots are exceedingly elusive. Most sightings are so random, fleeting. I suspect that unless they're aggressive like an elephant in musk, looking for a fight or a confrontation with a human, you're very unlikely to see one. In my opinion, the vast majority of Bigfoots are just going to disappear into the ether.
Well, let's hope you're wrong about that, said Stanley, piling onto the open grill a whole pile of bacon rashers. I raised a questionable brow. What are you doing, Stan? We've only just eaten. Shouldn't you be saving all that delicious, lovely bacon for breakfast tomorrow? I happen to have it on good authority that the smell of fried bacon is a drawing card for a Bigfoot, which is why I'm cooking it. It might help to get a Bigfoot to come to us, not the other way round. Bacon is the perfect bait. I smiled at my friend Riley. Stanley always had faith in the impossible. I certainly admired his ardent determination to encounter a Bigfoot, but I seriously doubted his efforts would be rewarded. I bit my lip, refraining myself from discouraging him, as that would be very cruel.
But in truth I doubted his chances of success, for stumbling upon such an ambiguous, transient, fugacious creature, as elusive as the Scarlet Pimpernel, was exceedingly unlikely. We were camped in a northeastern part of California, bordering Oregon and Nevada, a secret location that was privy to a few rather spectacular, ancient, abandoned, and long since forgotten hiking and horse riding trails that were barely ever used, or possibly even known about by the public. We had hitched up our tents around a silvery lake, on the edge of a flowery meadow, bordered by sagebrush, where two of Stanley's beloved black and bay horses, Silver Birch and Firecracker, were grazing away happily to their heart's content. In the long distance you could see the smouldering silhouettes of the undulating mountains that shimmered and gleamed under a cobalt blue sky. The pyramid shapes of the ponderosa pines and Douglas firs clustered around the valley in a very grandiose electric green ensemble, rather like prominent celestial beings gathering together for an important meeting. The day had folded away so fast, like the pages of a book being swiftly turned. For the first time in ages I was resonating with the wilderness, breathing in her crisp fresh air, marvelling in the sensation of the fresh breeze blowing against my skin, transfixed by the magnificence of her beguiling allure. For so long the scenery of my office had all but depicted four plain walls, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking one of Los Angeles' busy, bustling streets, along with a cheap, tarty picture of a calendar girl in a bikini that someone had put on my wall as their idea of a joke, possibly to get some kind of a rise out of their stiff boss. But I had absolutely no intention of giving them the satisfaction, so I had wilfully ignored it. And now the buckling, bedraggled calendar had been on my wall for over 8 years. The valley was now bathed in a resplendent, velvety black sky, superbly offset by the twinkling jewels of the silvery stars, along with the bright luminescence of a dazzling full moon. The sounds of crickets, frogs, and the occasional howl of a coyote or wolf serenaded the night with their reassuring symphonies, while the fresh scent of butterscotch, pine, sage, intermingled with wild flowers, appeared so much more pronounced on this magical evening, now heightening their floral bouquet with delicious smoky smells that travelled on the breeze like a wispy feather, the quintessential pulling card for a Bigfoot, so we hoped. Before long our eyelids became droopy as our conversation waned, drifting away like two disembodied ghostly voices caught on the wind. We knew then that sleep was graciously inviting us to embrace the world of our dreams. We needed little encouragement, so we hit our sleeping bags hard, with the fervour of two drunken men soon drifting off into a deep sleep. I awoke with a start, sitting bolt upright, my body trembling. I'd heard a noise. I was certain there were large feet trudging around our campsite, of the bipedal kind, that is. I did not feel excitement of any kind, but a feeling of dread, as terrifying chills shot down my spine in a nervous frenzy, while sweat began to break out on my brow. My fingers and hands became clammy. I glanced over to Stanley, who was snoring very loudly, oblivious to what was going on. But if that wasn't weird enough, my friend's snores were being replicated by something or someone outside our tent, who was making the same snoring sounds as Stanley. Was there some loony outside our tent trying to make fun of Stanley's snores, I wondered. It was so hard to wake the man up, even after shaking him briskly for a while. He just groaned, rolled over, continued to sleep, and ignored me, so unresponsive to my desperate attempts to wake him up. "Bigfoot!" I piped. "Bigfoot! Bigfoot! Bigfoot!" I knew those words would rouse him from his slumber, like a sleeping dog hearing the words, "Steak dinner, steak dinner, steak dinner." "Bigfoot!" he said, sitting bolt up, bouncing out of his foggy state like an exuberant puppy dog. "Where? Where?" The excitement on his face was bubbling over like a pot of peas on the cooker. "I only said that to wake you up," I said. "There's something outside of our tent. It might be a weirdo. It's copying your snoring. Listen." "It was copying me snoring," said Stanley, growing even more exuberant. "It just might be a Bigfoot if that's the case. They mimic everything." The sound of heavy thumping footfall, accompanied by the snapping of crunching twigs and leaves, was very discernible. The ponderous, rather alarming footsteps around our campsite became so much more pronounced. and way too close for comfort. This haunting revelation did not bode well with me, knowing something monstrously huge was in our midst, something predatory, dangerous, frightening. The rising level of trepidation I felt had momentarily been expunged by a few sharp shooting pains in my leg that were taking off like fireworks, but were barely noticed by me. The footsteps suddenly stopped, as if the owner of the feet was standing very still. All of a sudden the banging of the cast-iron grill from the fire pit could be heard, being crashed around like dirty dishes in a sink, washed by a pair of clumsy hands. Whoever was out there was meddling around with the fire pit, and they were not doing a good job in remaining discreet. "The bacon," I whispered. "Did you leave it on the grill?" "Of course I did," said Stanley. "I told you, didn't I? It's the perfect bait." All of a sudden we heard a thundering echo in the woods, moving towards our campsite, as feet bounded towards our tent. Every thunderous footstep of the approaching entity, whatever on earth it was, seemed to make the ground quiver, heave, shake, under what must have been a substantial, sizable weight, which led me to swiftly conclude that we did indeed have a couple of Bigfoots in our midst, as who else or what else could pound the ground with such a forceful power, other than an elephant or a rhino. Whatever this thing was, it was clearly bipedal. Stanley reached for his rifle, nodding to me. "I'm just going to take a peek outside," he said, giving me a thrilled, cheeky look, like a boy who'd caught the girl across the road in a compromising position. "I think we have 2 Bigfoots outside our tent," he whispered excitedly. "Are you stark raving mad?" Stanley, I protested. "You're going out there, leaving me in here, all on my own, to the mercy of the wolves? Are you kidding me?" Stanley did not listen. His focus was intense. He stealthily unzipped the door of the tent, cautiously creeping out of the opening, with me following close behind him. I had no intention of staying in my tent, like a banana in its skin, waiting to be pulled apart and devoured. I'd rather know what it was we were facing than hanker down low in the tent and just wait and see. Then we saw them. Nothing prepares you for seeing 2 incongruous creatures like this in our reality. Me and Stanley stood very still. We watched the scene unfolding before our very eyes, hardly daring to even draw breath, in case it should draw attention to us. It was like we were watching a movie. It was all so bizarre, so surreal. We could see 2 Bigfoots, one significantly smaller than the other. The smaller one, which I imagine was the former creature that had previously impersonated Stanley's snores, was sitting opposite our fire pit, with the cast-iron grill in his oversized hands. His pink tongue was licking the vertical iron ridges of the grill, rather like a popsicle. I assume he must have eaten all the bacon, and couldn't get enough of the delicious salty, smoky flavours. The larger Bigfoot, who was clearly female, based on her feminine heart-shaped face and low-slung breasts, had clearly only recently arrived on the scene. She was evidently trying her damnedest to evacuate her belligerent son from our camping location, which she regarded with the same level of angst and trepidation that I'd only been feeling moments before. She was possibly all too well aware that humans could carry rifles, could be reactive and threatening, not always to be trusted. It would seem that her youngling, who was not small by any manner of means, but clearly a juvenile, was impetuous, headstrong, and wilful. He had been surreptitiously lured away from his mother's charge by the delicious aroma of smoky bacon. I imagine he'd sneaked away on hot pursuit of the delicious smell. The mother wasn't at all happy with her son, who in her opinion, I imagine, she perceived was uncomfortably far too close to a human camping site for her liking. Her obstinate youngling was having none of it, as his tongue was almost superglued to that grill. I could feel every inch of the mother's level of annoyance as she studied her son with an expression of exasperation in her deep-set, treacle-coloured eyes. She was no different to any other weary mother, being bugged over and over again by her demanding child in a store, begging her to buy the candy bars, and being unrelenting in the process. In truth, I was rather surprised I didn't feel fear, but then again, how could I? In truth, the pertinent interaction between mother and son was so intrinsically human, so incredibly relatable, that I could actually perceive exactly what was going on, like an open book. The mother was about 6.5 foot tall, approximately 500 pounds, a very powerful, sturdy build, muscular body, exceedingly long arms. I noticed her cone-shaped head flowed into a large pair of shoulders seamlessly, while her whole body was covered in dark brown, long-flowing hair. Her son, on the other hand, was as tall as her, but long, lean and lanky, like a skinny teenager that has not filled out yet into his own body, but his energy was exceedingly juvenile. The mother was eyeing her son, with a grievous, despairing look of indignation and frustration on her face. She was trying desperately to pull him away from the grill with her overlong arms, but he firmly stood his ground, wilfully refusing to budge an inch. She was talking to him in a low tone, like a human whisper, obviously perceiving that two sleeping campers might be awoken if she was to raise her voice in any way. I'm glad to say she was obliviously unaware that she was being watched, as all her focus was completely on her son. Finally, the mother had reached the point of no return. Enough was enough. Her patience had worn thin. She grabbed the grill from the surprised youngling, who let out a little warning growl to his mother, like a small, snappy dog. The mother ran with our grill in her arms into the woods, the smaller Bigfoot running after her, screaming loudly. It was a clever ploy to get her child away from the campsite, I imagine. We watched in reverent awe as the two creatures glided away. Believe me, I have no explanation for this, but they looked like they floated, even though the ground heaved under their weight. For a moment Stanley stood still, not saying a thing, staring at me, his eyes as wide as saucers. "Oh my God," he said. We saw a Bigfoot." He looked like a boy who had been given a train set at Christmas and could not wipe the ecstatic grin off his face. "Correction," I said. "We saw two Bigfoot, a mother and her youngling, who was almost as big as her." "I can't believe it," said Stanley, clasping his hands over his mouth. "I can't bloody believe it. Did you see how beautiful they were? How intelligent? Oh my God! I'm so happy, bro. So happy." I nodded. "They were beautiful," I said. "It's beyond me how anyone could kill a Bigfoot. They're so human." Needless to say, we discovered the following morning after we awoke from another sleep that the grill had surreptitiously been replaced and returned to our fire pit, almost as if nothing had happened, although the grill was completely clean. If we had not witnessed the absurd interaction between a mother and her youngling, we would have been none the wiser. It is without a shadow of a doubt in my mind that this event with a Bigfoot changed my life in more ways than you can ever imagine. It was like the locked, bolted door to my heart had been opened, as if the prisoner, that was me, hiding behind the closed door, had suddenly peered out from behind the wooden barricades for the very first time, rather like a butterfly emerging from a cocoon, embracing the world with a joyful new resolve, ever glad to have left the confines of its silken imprisonment. For so long my emotions had been frozen, as keeping the painful memories of my past in this solid, hardened state meant I could pretend that they weren't there, rather like the leg of lamb sitting at the bottom of the freezer that you clean forgot about. Slowly and surely the sun had risen over the horizon of my life, casting its golden shadows over my frozen inner world. The ice was beginning to melt away, while green shoots of recovery were budding, emerging like spring flowers bursting through the ground. Suddenly everything for me seemed brighter. I was happier now, more open to becoming the man I once was. It would seem that even my company employees no longer recognized the big boss, who was formerly cold, abrasive, unfriendly. But now I was different, very different. It was my secretary who'd been working for me tirelessly for over 5 long years that turned around to me and said, "Mr. Hughes, I don't know what's happened to you, but you went away for a weekend, and well, you've come back, and you're different. You're actually nice, very nice. I always suspected that you were really rather nice, but you just didn't show it very well." I looked at my secretary for the first time in 5 years, the 5 years that she had worked for me. Before that, I'd barely acknowledged her, barked out orders, given her long to-do lists, but she was like a beautiful flower in the meadow that had been willfully ignored by me. But suddenly my eyes had been opened, as the walls of protection around my heart came crumbling down. I kid you not, Within days, and I mean days, I'd asked my secretary to be my wife. I never looked back now. I'm such a happily married man, with 3 wonderful children, and I couldn't be happier. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, Mrs. Cromwell, my employer, who was also an exceedingly good family friend of ours, had informed me that the old lady, Mrs. Julia Dumbledore, who was staying in cabin number 5, had requested to see me urgently. Yet despite Mrs. Cromwell's very best efforts to find out what actually was going on, the woman had remained staunchly tight-lipped, wilfully refusing to give any reasonable explanation as to why she wanted to talk to me, exclusively about a matter which she explained was of extreme significance. In the circumstances, this was highly abnormal protocol, as the cleaning staff working for Mrs. Cromwell barely ever interacted with the visitors staying in the wooden cabins here on her sprawling property in Anchorage, Alaska. So why on earth did this woman want to see me? What was the matter of extreme importance that she needed to discuss with me? I could not even begin to comprehend what this incongruous situation was actually all about. I felt instinctively uncomfortable about this uncustomary, unorthodox interaction with a guest staying with us of whom I'd never met before. I was shy at the very best of times. My painful reticence meant I naturally preferred to keep myself to myself, so conversing with strangers was not something I gladly welcomed. Why could she not speak to you, Mrs. Cromwell? I complained bitterly. If she has a complaint about my work, why did she not come to you? After all, you're the owner of the cabins. What on earth would she want with me? I'm only one of the cleaners, for goodness sake. It makes no sense for her to single me out like this. I don't know, dear. I wish I could give you an answer. The poor old dear. She was in a dreadful state, very flustered, upset even, although she hid it remarkably well, but it was plain to see. She refused to tell me what was actually wrong. I will say this, dear, though. She was doggedly determined to see you. She was obstinate about it, to the point of rudeness, I might add. She told me in no uncertain terms that she must see the cleaning lady that cleaned her cabin without delay. It was more of a command than a request, actually. I did tell her she was welcome to talk to me about any problem she was having with the cabins, as it's of course in our interest to make all our guests feel as comfortable as possible. But she obtrusively insisted that I sent the cleaning girl to the cabin right away. Tell her I will make it worth her while. Believe me, Sophia, the woman was tenacious, resolute, unrelenting in her demands, rather like a pertinacious crocodile with its jaws clammed tightly down on a chicken. For a moment I thought she'd throw a hissy fit, so I told her I'd send you over to her cabin just to calm her down. The woman was behaving well, kind of strange actually. I can't fathom what her problem is, but it's clearly connected to you. Worth my while? Worth my while, I repeated, mulling over the words in my head, as if trying to dissect the assiduous underlying meaning to this cryptid conundrum. My brow furrowed in perplexment. What on earth could she want from me, I wondered, feeling more than a little bewildered. You didn't accidentally break something of value by any chance, did you? Asked Mrs. Cromwell, when you were cleaning her cabin. No, of course not. I had no problems cleaning her cabin. It was a relatively normal routine job, just like it is every day of the week. Nothing went awry. I can't think of any red flags blowing in the air to me. I certainly didn't break anything, if that's what you're thinking. I'm always exceedingly careful about things like that. Well, whatever it was, dear, the woman is in a dreadful state. Something has seriously rattled her cage, very significantly, if you ask me. I wasn't happy about this at all, not one bit. The more Mrs. Cromwell told me about this woman's insistence on seeing me, the more unsettled I became. I felt a rising level of angst. If there was anything I avoided whenever possible, it was disagreeable confrontations of any kind with difficult people. I desperately tried to rewind that hour of cleaning to see if I had overlooked something. I had cleared and swept out the ash from the fireplace, stacked the fireplace meticulously with wood. I'd scrubbed the bathroom, replaced the toilet paper, polished the television so that it sparkled, gleamed and twinkled from within an inch of its life. I was absolutely certain I had left that entire cabin spotless, without a speck of dust in sight. So why was this woman hunting me down? I had worked for Mrs. Cromwell for over 5 years now. Initially I'd become a cleaner just to earn that quintessential pocket money, to put towards buying myself a Land Rover truck. But the job hadn't been so bad after all. On the contrary, as bizarre as it may actually sound to you, especially to those who despise any form of housework, I actually rather enjoyed my job, found it somewhat therapeutic. My affluent, successful father worked in Anchorage in a thriving, lucrative and booming business. He was a man of distinction that had never been predisposed to spoiling any of his children, as he unequivocally ascertained that we needed to learn the value of working hard, and not to be handed everything on a silver platter like spoilt rich kids, some who had not worked a day in their lives. He didn't want us to become like that, mollycoddled, wrapped up in cotton wool, helpless, dependent, unable to fend for ourselves in the big bad world. "If I give you everything," he would say, "then you will never have the opportunity into discovering your full potential in life, or what you're really made of, and I have no intention of robbing that privilege from you." My father had tried to persuade me to work for him, but I liked a stress-free job, always had, even if the pay wasn't that great, without deadlines, pressure, or sitting behind a boring desk all day. I couldn't abide that. In a strange way, I had found cleaning somewhat relaxing. It was an ordered, structured kind of job, and I was that kind of a person, with a slight inclination and propensity towards OCD. So organising things and putting them in their correct place was literally in my DNA. I simply hated things being out of order, or in disarray or chaos. Suffice to say, apart from anything else, I loved my chats with Mrs. Cromwell, who was one of the most interesting people I'd ever had the pleasure to meet. I'd always sought out the company of older people, as their insights into the world, along with the lessons that they had attained along their life journey, invariably helped me to make better and wiser decisions in regards to my own life. It helped me to avoid the inevitable pitfalls, mistakes, bad decisions I would likely make without an older person's invaluable advice to steer me down the right course. I know in some cultures around the world, the older generations are revered for their quintessential wisdom, which is sought after by younger generations for their guidance. An example of Mrs. Cromwell's profound wisdom was when I was dating a local lad called Hugh MacLeod. The young man was messing me around emotionally by blowing hot and cold on me all the time, so I never knew exactly where I stood with him. Did he like me? Didn't he? Even the dandelions in the flowery field couldn't give me an affirmative answer to that question as I blew their fluffy seeds away in the wind. The message had always been so mixed. Mrs. Cromwell had simply said to me, "End it with Hugh, dear. He's not committed to you, nor will he ever be. I can promise you of that. I've seen his type before, dear. The aimless drifters in life. You mark my words, he's exactly like a piece of timber bobbing down a stream, following its course with no mind of his own. You want a real man that decisively steers the timber, all by himself, defines its course, determines and deliberates where it will go, not leaving it to random chance. I can read that Hugh like a book, love. Believe me, it won't end well for the two of you. The man is so confused. You don't need to be lumbered with someone like that, with such ambivalent conjecture, irresolute hesitancy, vacillating doubt. He's in limbo, and so will you be if you spend enough time in his company." I had listened to Mrs. Cromwell's hearty advice, ever grateful not to be in the roller coaster of a relationship any more that had cost me more than I was willing to pay. Sleepless nights, chaos, uncertainty, upheaval, tears, and lots of them. But without Mrs. Cromwell's sagacious words, I assure you I would still be caught up in this going nowhere slowly relationship, rather like a fish tangled up in a net, or like a ship at sea completely having lost sight of its course. So back to the question at hand, the enigmatic matter that I was dealing with right now. Could I have possibly overlooked something, I wondered, in regard to Mrs. Dumbledore's cabin? Had I forgotten to dust the top of her bedroom door, or something like that? Or had she stumbled upon a thin layer of dust that I had wilfully missed, and couldn't wait to rub my nose in it? Was the mysterious guest staying at our cabin with the strangest surname I'd ever heard, that was more fitting for a character in a fictional novel than anything else? Was she going to come down on me like a ton of bricks as a result of her dissatisfaction with my cleaning prowess? If indeed that were the case, that would be the first time that someone accused me of failing to clean effectively. But I suppose there is always a first time for everything. In truth, I prided myself in being scrupulous, proficient as a cleaner. But you did, of course, get people who were so fastidious that unless the cabin positively rank of bleach, they weren't at all happy. Over the years working for Mrs. Cromwell, there had been the odd customer complaint, but not many, and it was usually about the silliest things you've ever heard, like the loo paper being 2-ply instead of 3, or a vague smudge on the window that had been overlooked, or even a lone spider web in an obscure place you would have never noticed. I made my way to cabin number 5, my skinny knees wobbling beneath me, my body jiggling nervously, my hands clammy. I didn't even have to get to the door before it was thrust open by a woman in her 70s, wearing a disagreeable expression on her face. Her thin lips curled downwards in a large frown. Her beady dark eyes literally drilled through mine like a jackhammer. She was wearing the kind of offended look, with hints of disgusted revulsion, that you often see people giving a dog if it lifts its leg over your pristine settee to mark its territory. By now my heart was thundering in my chest violently, for I could sense that I was in seriously big trouble. But what had I done? I couldn't even imagine. I felt like a naughty schoolchild having been caught playing truant, being bundled off to the head's office to explain my wilful insubordination. My face was now flushed with a pink rosy hue, as if I was already guilty of a crime that I had clearly not committed. But irrespective of my innocence, I felt guilty as hell. Furthermore, to add insult to injury, I was wearing that guilt on my face as blazonly as a pair of bright pink eclectic glasses that you couldn't fail to miss. In a trice I could now fully comprehend and even appreciate why perfectly innocent people sometimes were cajoled into confessing a crime that they'd never ever committed. You heard about it on television all the time. It would always perplex me that anyone would raise their hands and say, "I did it! I did it!" Now I understood how it could so easily happen, given the way I was feeling right now. For indeed, if I had been a dog in this woman's formidable presence, I would almost certainly have had my tail tucked between my legs, my ears cocked back, and I would be cowering in submission, desperate to appease her in some way, confessing to almost anything just to keep the peace. Mrs. Dumbledore gestured for me to sit on one of the fabulously elegant upholstered lounge chairs in the cabin that had so painstakingly been selected by Mrs. Cromwell many moons ago. I complied, reluctantly perching at the very edge of the seat, feeling completely out of my depth, rather like a fish out of water. The woman was exceedingly intimidating. She had that authoritarian energy about her, as if she knew the movers and shakers in high society, was a woman of power, influence, persuasion, and money, lots of money, but of the kind that had passed down her family line from hefty inheritances over bountiful generations. She wore her white hair away from her face, pinned in a bun. Her porcelain skin was papery, thin, transparent even, and exceedingly crinkled, most especially around the eyes. There were deep frown lines between her eyebrows. She regarded me through a shrewd pair of hawk-like brown eyes, the frown deepening on her face as she began to study me. "How old are you, girl?" she asked me. "I'm 23. "I see," she said. Mrs. Dumbledore's frown increased exponentially, as the deep folds besides the corner of her mouth were beginning to look like railway tracks. "So how long are you going to keep this pretence up, girl?" she demanded in a hoarse voice. "The easiest way for us to sort out this problem is to make a deal, and I'll say no more about it, not to anyone," she said, tapping her nose as if to reassure me. "Mrs. Dumbledore, excuse me if I seem rather ignorant, but that's because I probably am at this particular moment. You see, I don't have a clue what on earth you're talking about." "I want it back. I know you stole it. I want it back. It's of great sentimental value to me. Besides being worth a small fortune, but that's neither here nor there. It was given to me by my late husband on the eve of our engagement 55 years ago, to be exact, when he proposed to me here in cabin number 5. That's why I'm staying here, to celebrate the anniversary of his proposal all those long years ago. I can't live without it. I have to have it back." I was stunned. "You think I've stolen something from you, don't you?" I said, looking at Mrs. Dumbledore aghast. "I may be many things, Mrs. Dumbledore, but I assure you I'm not a thief. I would never wilfully take something that wasn't mine. I've worked for Mrs. Cromwell for over 5 years as a cleaner. I assure you she can vouch for my integrity." "Are you going to make this very hard for an old woman? I've got more things to do with my time than play charades. The last thing I want to have to do is to grovel. But I assure you I will if I must. Look, I know the score. You're poor, I'm rich. You have my ring, I have money. I will pay you handsomely for its safe return, and I'll say no more about the matter. But I must have it back. I really must. It's my physical link to my husband in this world, all I have left of him that is tangible." "You think I'm poor, Mrs. Dumbledore, because I'm a cleaner? You couldn't be more wrong. Normally I'd be offended by your insinuations, but I'm not. If you must know, my father is one of the richest men in Anchorage. Granted, it's not inherited wealth like yours clearly is. It's through grit, toil and hard work, whereby he made his vast $1 million fortune. But if I was desperate for money, really desperate that is, I'd go to him for help. Not brazenly steal it from one of our guests. Mrs. Dumbledore, in my book, that would be deplorable." At this, Mrs. Dumbledore looked startled, as if she couldn't comprehend exactly what I was saying. She stammered for a moment, wobbling uneasily, as if she was on a rocking boat at sea. But I don't understand. Why would you be a cleaner if you're a millionaire's daughter? It makes no sense to me at all. As a woman of substantial means myself, I've never cleaned a thing a day in my life. Those menial jobs are left for desperate people, I said, finishing the sentence for her. Mrs. Dumbledore nodded, looking ever so slightly sheepish, as if she too was rather surprised by her blatant assumptions. "I'm not offended, Mrs. Dumbledore," I assured her. "You think this way possibly because you are from inherited wealth. It is understandable. You've lived a privileged lifestyle all your life. My father came from a background of poverty. He worked hard for every single penny he earned. There is a difference, a marked difference. My father's always encouraged all 3 of us kids to work so hard. It didn't matter if we were mucking out a stable or working in a grandiose office. The principle was always the same. If you must know, I started cleaning the cabins for Mrs. Cromwell at first just as a holiday job, to save money to buy my own truck. My father could have given me the money to buy a whole fleet of trucks, but then it would have defeated the whole purpose. It would have meant nothing to me. "Sophia," he would say, "if I hand you over a plethora of money, like chocolate-coated candies, you'll never fully comprehend or appreciate how good it feels to be independently successful, not needing to depend on others for your livelihood. It is something I've never actually forgotten." "So you're saying you didn't steal my ring? Is that what you're saying?" "Of course I didn't steal your ring, Mrs. Dumbledore. What did it look like? Are you sure you didn't misplace it somewhere?" "No, I keep it beside my bedside table every night, so I can look at it. It makes me feel close to my late husband, brings back all kinds of wonderful memories of the magical years we spent together as husband and wife. He was very good for me, you know." For a moment I froze. The colour drained from my face. "It wasn't in an old velvety box, was it? A blue velvety box, by any chance?" "The very same," she said, growing excited. "Do you know where it is?" "Oh, my goodness! I don't believe it," I said, clasping my hands over my mouth. I don't know what to say, Mrs. Dumbledore." "You're scaring me, girl. What did you do with my velvet box?" "Mrs. Dumbledore, I saw a blue velvet box in your wastepaper basket. I threw it away. I thought you discarded it. I imagine it must have fallen off the bedside table into the bin by accident." "You threw it away?" cried Mrs. Dumbledore. "You threw it away? How could you, you stupid, stupid girl? The old woman's face became so overcast, like a grey sky with heavy clouds threatening to burst into rain showers. The poor woman was visibly upset. To be fair, Mrs. Dumbledore, the box was in the bin. It looked old and worn. I thought you'd thrown it away. It did look like it belonged in the bin. It didn't cross your mind to even open the box just to look? No, I didn't. It was so worn. I was so busy. I had 2 other cabins to clean after yours. I was running late. Besides, I don't make a habit of going through the trash. I never have. It was worn, dear, because it was old. It was the box that was presented to me on the day my husband popped the question, here in this very cabin. Why do you think I'm even staying here in the first place? I hardly want to replace it, do I? It has sentimental value. The box, the ring, everything. Oh, I'm so sorry, Mrs. Dumbledore. I don't know what to say. I feel terrible about this. You're right. You're absolutely right. I should have looked in the box to check that it actually was empty. It wouldn't have taken a second. I'm very, very sorry. I'm so angry with myself for being so short-sighted. The old woman's eyes were misting over with tears. They began to pour down her face. It's my only connection to Rolf, she cried. I think you'd better go, girl, before I say something I'm going to regret. I stood there, frozen to the spot like an ice statue, as waves of guilt shot through my body like shooting stars. I could feel a nausea welling up in the pit of my stomach, rising up in the back of my throat, filling my mouth with a bitter taste. I stammered as I looked at Mrs. Dumbledore awkwardly. It was clear no money in the world could replace what she had lost, otherwise I'd give it to her. I'll find it for you, Mrs. Dumbledore. I'll find it for you, I promised her. I will leave no stone unturned until I do. Mrs. Dumbledore looked doubtful. Good luck with that, girl. I don't fancy your chances. I remember I walked away from the cabin, feeling the weight of the world on my shoulders. I knew that looking for Mrs. Dumbledore's ring would truly be like searching for a needle in a haystack, but needless to say, I would die trying. I felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. I had thrown away her precious jewel, that for her was the representation of the loving marriage she had enjoyed for over 50 long years, which she had come back to celebrate in cabin number 5, to re-engage in those nostalgic memories of when her late husband on bended knees had proposed to her, presenting her with a diamond engagement ring in the blue velvety box that I had thrown away. I had come along like a bull in a china shop, pulling out the carpet from under her feet. And so it was, after a series of frantic phone calls, I found myself at the Homer landfill site with a younger man called Douglas Fairbank, who claimed to have dumped the rubbish from our area in this specific location. Like many Alaskan men, he was handsome, strong, generous to a fault. He was attired in a blue plaid jacket and jeans, but in my opinion, he had to have the worst job in the entire world. Fortunately, he generously offered to help me in this futile search for the lost treasure. I was ever thankful that it was not one of the larger landfill sites, or I don't know what I would have done. Much like anything in Alaska, this landfill site was in the heart of the exquisite Alaskan landscape, surrounded by the pyramid shapes of the spruce trees, along with the occasional cottonwood and balsam polar that surrounded the flattened area in a rather circular layout. When we arrived at the landfill site, it was overwhelming for me. It was such a dauntingly vast area of recently dumped rubbish, but the amount of it was overwhelming. I had no idea it would be as brutal as this, as heaps of rubbish were sprawled absolutely everywhere, like a minefield. I had no idea how I was going to actually sift through the filth, as the rotting smell was nauseously sickening. It made me want to hurl. It smelt putrid, rank, exactly like a decomposing skunk. You're not the first, nor will you be the last to be searching in a landfill site for your lost treasure. We have often had police searching for evidence out here, sifting through piles of trash with police dogs, looking for addresses, receipts, bills, and other forms of DNA evidence that I would personally rather not mention. Ooh, that does sound grisly, I said. Do they find what they're looking for? It's a 50-50 chance, but yes, they sometimes do find what they're looking for. You see, we have to painstakingly log and record all the details of where the trash was dumped, at what time and at what specific location, so that if needs must, we can retrace its route. In your case, the recent dump was over on this specific spot, he said, pinpointing to the area that needed searching. What is it that you've lost? It's a ring, I said, a valuable ring, in a very old velvet blue ring box, which is why I brought a metal detector along with me, I said, watching a couple of loud trucks unloading their rubbish over a vast area. You see, the ring belongs to an old lady. It was given to her on her engagement over 55 years ago. Imagine that. There's so much riding on finding it. The poor woman's heart is broken. And the worst part of it all is I'm responsible. I'm the one that threw it away. I don't fancy your chances, I'm being honest with you, of finding a ring out here. Although, of course, it has happened before. There's a lot of stuff in here that would set off the metal detector, like tin cans, stuff like that. It'll be buzzing all the time. There really is no point for you to use it. I'm never going to find the ring, am I? I mean, it could be anywhere here. This place is so intimidating. How do I even begin to start searching for something so tiny in this monumental mess? Just give it your best shot. It's all you can do. The good news is it was in a box. If it was lying loose, I don't think in a month of Sundays you would ever find it. Believe me, there are no words to describe what a nightmare it was, sifting through this horrifying garbage. It was, however, a poignant insight into what actually people throw away. I felt as if the rank, putrid smell was clinging to my clothes. I wanted to heave, it was so revolting. To date, it really was, quite literally, the most disgusting thing I've ever had to do in my entire life. And for days afterwards, that rotting smell of garbage clung to my clothes and even to my skin like the aphids on a rosebud, almost impossible to shift. Take a break, said Douglas, looking at me sympathetically. I know this is a daunting task for you. You look positively sick, green at the gills. I'll keep looking for you. I didn't need any encouragement, but bolted through the spruce trees. In a trice I began to throw up violently in the bushes, spewing up the contents of my stomach. I could also hear someone else getting sick very close to me. It would seem that others were not immune to throwing up near a landfill site, and who could blame them? The smell was repugnant. I realized that the person that was spewing their guts must be in a dreadful way, far worse than I was, because they hadn't stopped hurling, retching, puking and heaving. In truth, I wanted nothing better than to turn a blind eye to it, pretend that I hadn't heard it. It occurred to me that they must be in a very bad way indeed. They could potentially need medical help if I ignored them. Like I'd ignored the blue velvet box in the bin, I might just live to regret my negligence. I manoeuvred my way through the spruce trees to seek out the poor vomiting man. Then I saw the obscure silhouette of a shadowy figure, moving between the trees, swaying backwards and forwards. It was worse than I thought. The poor man was convulsing from hurling so much. He looked terrible. "Are you all right, sir?" I called, as the retching sounds continued even as I spoke. "You sound bad. Should I call for help?" I moved towards the man, stopping dead in my tracks, hardly daring to believe what I was seeing. For the stranger making those puking sounds was not a human being at all, but a Bigfoot. Now, living in Alaska, I'd frequently heard of Bigfoot encounters. In fact, among many of the suspects of all the people that go vanishing from the Alaskan Triangle every year, never to be seen or heard from again, Bigfoot was listed as one of them. I had serious reservations about this, for I believe the disappearances had a lot more to do with the ley lines and electromagnetic anomalies in the triangle. For indeed stories about strange lights, peculiar creatures, ghostly sightings were commonplace among many of the locals here. I'd always believed in the outlandish critter, but I'd never imagined I'd have an encounter myself. Yet here I was, standing yards away from a Bigfoot. I could hardly believe it. I was not even quite sure how to react to the creature. Should I be afraid and run for my life? or should I be absolutely delighted to have such a peculiar interaction? I wasn't sure, but it would seem fear eluded me, rather like the smoke from one of Anchorage's many chimneys on a cold night. If anything, I was completely mesmerised by this outlandish critter. At a guess, the Bigfoot was possibly 7 foot tall, although I couldn't be sure about that. But one thing I could not dispute was that he was huge, monstrously huge, very burly, stockily built. But then again, everything in Alaska is always on the larger side. He was covered in long flowing dark hair, possessed the typical overlong arms and pointed head. But one thing that caught me off guard was how uncannily human his face actually was, with strong Native American characteristics, most typically seen in the high cheekbones, the slanted forehead, and the almond-shaped eyes that were deep set in his skull, a large flat nose, and full but thin lips. The creature was watching me very curiously. He continued to make those vile, retching sounds, his mischievous eyes glinting with humour, as if wallowing in my astonishing reactions with some gusto. Then it hit me like a brick to the head. This comical creature had been imitating me spewing out my guts. It appeared to find my throwing up in the bushes terribly amusing. I also got the sense he enjoyed making the sounds, rather like a parrot that picked up a new word to add to its vocal repertoire. I'd certainly introduced him to some interesting new sounds, and he appeared to be as pleased as Punch about that. "Sophia!" I could hear Douglas's voice calling me through the trees. I felt so annoyed. I was so enjoying this intimate interaction with this extraordinary creature. Now I was certain it was all over. At the sound of Douglas's voice calling me, the creature turned around and glided away. But as he did this, he continued to replay the sound of my hurling. Then he was gone from my sight. "Is this what you are looking for?" came Douglas gliding through the trees, holding in his hands a battered can of baked beans that was now crawling with maggots. But at the bottom of the red gooey mixture, along with a few scattered beans, was a box that I recognised. "Oh my God!" I gasped. "I think it's it! I can't believe it! You found it!" The box was so disgusting, covered with goo, smelling of skunk. I dragged it out of the can with a stick and opened it cautiously. In the centre of the box, balanced on a steep incline in the velvet, was quite literally the most breathtaking opulent blue diamond ring that I'd ever seen. Even Douglas gasped. "That must be worth a bloody fortune," he said, eyeing the sparkling jewel in awe. "And it ended up in a land site. Let me tell you, the angels were with us today. How I found it, I can't even fathom." "It may be a very expensive jewel, Douglas, but the value of this ring, to its owner, is not monetary, I assure you. Thank you so much for your help." "Well, if it brings a smile to your face, it brings a smile to mine. It was a pleasure to be of help." Poor Mrs. Dumbledore was not the woman I'd first encountered a day ago, when she reluctantly opened the door to my persistent knocks and frantic calls. "Mrs. Dumbledore! Mrs. Dumbledore! Please let me in, Mrs. Dumbledore! Mrs. Dumbledore!" The normally formidable woman looked almost childlike, vulnerable, delicate even. When she opened the door to me, her long white wispy hair was not pinned back in a bun anymore, but lay messily scattered around her face like a mermaid. Her eyes were so pink, there was telltale pink marks all over her skin, that gave me the distinct impression that she had been crying, and crying very hard. Her dark eyes were layered in sadness. I knew that I was the cause of this woman's distress. It was all I could do not to burst into tears myself. I felt so bitterly ashamed that my careless actions had brought on so much despair. "Oh, it's you again. Come in." As I entered the cabin, I could see the photographs of Mrs. Dumbledore's husband scattered all over her couch, as if she'd been brooding over nostalgic memories from her past. "Is that your late husband?" I asked, looking towards the photographs. May I look?" I asked, lifting up the photograph to study it closely. "He was a handsome man, Miss Dumbledore. You were very lucky." "Oh, I was very lucky indeed," agreed Mrs. Dumbledore. "Gabriel was the love of my life. Oh, such a gentleman, a fine hunter, a mischievous sense of humour. He was forever teasing me. He knew how to ruffle my feathers, loved putting the wind up my sails. He knew not to take life too seriously. He was so good for me. You see, I tend to be rather too intense. He knew how to lighten me up, help me to see the funny side of things, you know. I nodded. I can see he's quite the charmer, Mr. Dumbledore. Oh, I really miss him, said Mrs. Dumbledore, her eyes misting over with tears as one rolled down her cheek. You spent 50 years with the love of your life, and when you lose him, it's like part of yourself also dies. Oh, Mrs. Dumbledore, I'm so sorry, I said, grabbing her into my arms and sobbing into her shoulders. I'm sorry. It's all my fault. I didn't mean to cause you all this distress. I didn't mean to throw away your ring. Now, dear, the last thing I want to do is to upset you. Don't blame yourself for what happened. Besides, it's only a ring. It's what's in here, she said, pointing to her heart, that counts. But Mrs. Dumbledore, you don't understand. I found your ring. That's why I'm here. Against all the odds, I found it. In a can of baked beans. At the landfill site. Mrs. Dumbledore began to chuckle. What's so funny? I asked. The baked beans. Gabriel loved baked beans. This is his kind of humour. I'm telling you, girl, he led you to find that ring. And finding it in a can of baked beans, well, it's his way of telling me he's still around. I pulled out a brand new blue velvety box from my pocket in my jacket. I'm sorry, I said, but I had to replace the box for you. The old one smells of the landfill. You really don't want to smell that. Even the kind man who helped me search for the ring informed me that the odds of finding it weren't good. I handed the delighted Mrs. Dumbledore the ring. She opened the box, staring at it as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. The sadness melted away from her eyes. Her brown eyes began to sparkle. I never thought I'd see it again, she said, smiling at me, as she studied the blue diamond. Oh, thank you, dear. You have no idea what this means to me. Oh, I think I do, Mrs. Dumbledore. I think I do, I said. That all happened about 10 years ago. Thinking about the entire event still tears me up. Who would have thought that a random trip to a landfill site would lead me to meeting the hairy man, as well as being able to witness the perfect love between an old woman and her long-enduring love affair with her husband. I would always wonder if the velvety box in the bin and the tin of baked beans in the landfill site was possibly her husband's way from beyond the grave of saying to his wife that he was still watching over her. I'm inclined to believe that this is the case. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. Oh, I'm so glad you've come. Please follow me, said the old lady, gesturing me with her hands, guiding me down the dark passageway of her home towards the closed door of her bedroom. The permed spiral ringlets of her unnaturally fiery bright red hair were tightly tied back in a messy ponytail, clasped together with a fluffy bright orange band. Some of their trailing wisps having wilfully escaped their entrapment, they trailed loosely around her face, bobbing buoyantly on her shoulders like the sails on a boat. The woman's arctic blue eyes that reminded me of a pale summer sky seemed very intense as she hovered outside the bedroom door like a buzzard, wondering when was the quintessential opportune moment to actually enter the room. She eyed me nervously. Her hesitancy was pronounced. She was certainly not eager to enter. "Everything all right?" I asked the woman. "You seem, well, a little nervous, a little flustered, perhaps." At that, the woman seemed to come out of her internal turmoil with a flying start, rather like a trapped bird having finally found the open window. She took in a deep breath, straightened, and tensed her back, visibly stiffening. She stood as still as an ice statue, hardly daring to move a muscle, fearful of making even a sound, while she placed a suggestive finger on her lips, as if warning me to be very quiet, while pressing her ear against the door, as though listening inside for something. In a very low, hushed voice, she whispered, "The radio's off. That's a very good sign. I think he's fallen asleep, fast asleep. Now is the perfect opportunity to have some words with you before he wakes up. The last thing I want is for him to eavesdrop." "I'm afraid," she said, "my husband, well, he's a very difficult man. Very cantankerous, a grouchy man, as stubborn as an old boot at the moment, with a loose tongue on him. You must please mind his manners. He's rather like a snapping turtle. All the other physiotherapists have refused to come back to treat him because of his belligerence. I hope you won't end up being one of them, and abandoning him like the others. That would be more than I could possibly bear. He's not really that bad, really, all bark and no bite. I secretly suspect he wouldn't be so moody if he wasn't in pain, although he's not admitting that he is. The trouble that leg is giving him has certainly put him on a short fuse. So what happened to your husband? Why did he shatter his leg so badly like this? I've read the doctor's report. It's quite a substantial injury. I don't know, said the lady, looking at me blankly. I'd love an answer to that question myself. All I know is that a hunter found him lying in a heap under a large spruce tree, but he was behaving strangely, refused to talk, even after numerous surgeries to that leg of his. I'm still none the wiser as to what happened to him. It's all decidedly strange. Why would he keep something like this from you, I asked. Surely it's straightforward what happened to him, I mean. My enigmatic husband is a man of few words, I'm afraid. Getting anything out of him is like extracting blood from a stone. Sometimes he's impossible, she said, looking at me tensely. Sorry, I didn't get your name, girl. Lily Harper. Lovely name, dear. It does suit you so well. I've always loved flowery names. They're so pretty. They remind me of summer meadows. Well, as I was saying, Lily, my husband Baron has always been introspective, self-contained and aloof. That's his nature. But no, he doesn't talk about that accident at all. If I so much as mention the accident to him, he snaps at me, jumps down my throat like an objectionable bullfrog, becomes erratic, vagarious, and almost fearful. Believe me, Baron Sawyer is many things, but a coward he is not. That man has nerves of steel. One of the bravest men I've ever known. Never been intimidated by a thing a day in his life. But after that accident, something transmogrified in him. But I cannot for the life of me fathom what it is. He's angry all the time, reactive, capricious, fluctuating in his moods, blowing hot and cold all the time. Interesting, I said. Very interesting. Your husband's case is fascinating. It sounds to me that your husband is showing signs of post-traumatic shock disorder. His unfathomable behaviour suggests as much to me, in my professional opinion, that is, but of course I'd have to talk to him first. The woman laughed at me, as if the very notion of her maverick husband being traumatised by anything so badly that he was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder was not even comprehensible. But she knew all too well that her husband, Baron Sawyer, was as different after that accident as a tadpole is from a frog. So my suggestive words hung in the air like a noxious smell she would wilfully rather ignore than actually acknowledge. I had lived and worked in Fairbanks, Alaska all my life. When you live in this ruthless, inhospitable, unmerciful part of the world, with huge extremes of weather, most especially the long, drawn-out winter days, with threatening, implacable sub-zero conditions, not to mention the vast areas of uninhabited, desolate wasteland, much that is not even accessible by road from beyond the Alaskan towns, you become mindfully aware of the fragility of life, how fragile, vulnerable, helpless we actually all are. As inconspicuous little ants in such a substantial no-man's land, this most certainly meant that many Alaskans embraced life head-on, appreciating it as a treasured gift of God, making the most of every day and every opportunity, living it to the fullest, thriving, prospering, taking risks in this reclusive badland, never ever knowing when one day your life could be demanded from you, in this unrepentant, snow-covered Sahara. Then there were, of course, other Alaskans too, overwhelmed by the secluded remoteness, sequestration and beleaguerment of the bleak, long, grueling months of insufferable cold winter days that had become cheerless, friendless to so many, who sought comfort in the power of drink to help alleviate their hopeless despair. So alcohol and drugs in this part of the world had become rampant. Living in Alaska makes you mindfully aware of the invisible war between man versus nature, of which man will ultimately always end up the loser. For the cruel blows of nature could catch us off guard at any given moment in time, wilfully taking you prisoner under her forceful power, or swallow you whole so that you disappear off the face of the earth, never to be seen or heard from again. The trouble with living in these relentless extremes in the Alaskan wilderness, there are invariably a plethora of things that can always go wrong, from freezing to death, getting hopelessly lost, or randomly encountering a dangerous predator. Anything could happen, and as a physiotherapist, I had heard it all and seen it all, so nothing surprised me. Well, what are we doing standing here? "Aren't you going to introduce me to my patient or not?" I asked, giving the woman a reassuring nudge. "After all, I'm here to help him walk again on that leg of his, am I not? So that he can resume a normal life." She nodded, looking at me warily, as if she was about to lead me into a den of wolves. I watched her nervously open the door to the bedroom. It creaked ajar, ever so slightly. She whispered, Baron, are you up? It's me, Lisa." "Oh, woman, leave me alone," grumbled a gruff, gravelly voice. "Can't a man get a bit of peace around here?" "Honey," said the old woman, opening the bedroom door more confidently this time, crossing the threshold over the wooden flooring, leading me directly into the room behind her. "This is your new physiotherapist. Her name's Lily Harper. She's come to help you with your exercises today." The cantankerous, irritable man looked at me scathingly. "Not another bloody therapist. Did I not tell you, Lisa? I'll walk on my own leg in my own good time. I'm so sick of being pushed around like this. I'm not a bloody rag doll for a puppeteer to bounce around on a plethora of strings, am I?" "It's good to meet you, Mr. Sawyer," I said, ignoring his angry protests. He was not the first grouchy, crabby patient I'd actually dealt with, nor would he be my last. "The feeling's not mutual," he said. "Do me a favour. Get the hell out of here. The last thing I need is a therapist butting her nose into my business. I told you. I'll walk again in my own time." "I'm not sure you will, Mr. Sawyer. Not without some professional help, that is, which is why I'm here. If you don't move your leg, it'll atrophy. It'll be a lot more difficult to walk on it then, especially when your muscles are all wasted. The sooner we get you moving on your leg, the better it'll be for you." "I wish they'd chopped the whole damn thing off and been done with it. Then I wouldn't have to put up with all this crap from the likes of well-meaning people like you, butting your nose in where it's not wanted, like a weasel in a box of cornflakes." "Actually, you would, Mr. Sawyer. I'd have to teach you how to walk on an artificial limb. It would be much more tortuous and grueling for you. Be grateful you still have your leg. I'm sure we can get you fighting fit in no time at all. Before you know it, you'll be back out there on the tundra, hunting, fishing, hiking, doing everything you did before." The man groaned. "All right," he said. "I'll do it if it means I can get rid of you. How long is this session going to take?" "Not long," I assured him. "The benefits are cumulative. The more we do the exercises, the easier it gets for you, as you begin to regain strength, build muscle. But I'm wondering why you're so reluctant to do these exercises in the first place, Mr. Sawyer. That is the big question." "Are you in a lot of pain? Because if you are, we can review your medications to see if we can find an alternative medication to make you more comfortable. No one should be in pain in this day and age, and suffer in silence. Pain can be managed these days." "It can," he said, his anger subsiding, and a glimmer of hopeful light illuminating his green eyes, like a train emerging through a dark tunnel, glad to see the light that had eluded it for a stretch. "It is rather uncomfortable," he admitted. "I get painful spasms in the thigh region, shooting pains, aches, pins and needles, throbbing sometimes." At this off-the-cuff, unexpected confession, his wife even looked surprised. Her eyes misted over with tears. "Oh, Baron," she said, "I suspected as much. Why on earth didn't you say anything? We could have done something sooner, and then maybe I wouldn't have to be living with such a bad-tempered grizzly for the last few weeks. I mean, I've been walking on eggshells for weeks now, terrified to say anything in case you jumped down my throat." Baron cleared his throat. "Other brave men have been through a lot worse than I have. Look what happened in Vietnam, with so many American soldiers. What right have I to complain about a little pain in my leg?" I sat down next to Mr. Sawyer's bed, grabbing one of his hands, squeezing it tightly. My action surprised him, catching him off guard. It was clear he hadn't expected this endearing gesture of encouragement from the likes of me, but I'm glad to say he seemed comforted by my spontaneous display of empathy. "Now that you mention the Vietnam War, Mr. Sawyer, that's a very interesting point of reference, I have to say, and of course comparison. If I may say so, in regards to your current condition, that is. First of all, I'd like to assure you that any of those young men that survived the Vietnam War, well, they did receive intensive pain management for their physical impediments. None of them needed to be heroes in dealing with that physical pain, just like you don't, but received all the morphine they required, as you should. But it was the wounds inside, Mr. Sawyer. Those were the ones that could never be bandaged up or ignored. Those wounds, if left to fester, become unbearable for many. It's known as post-traumatic stress disorder. I'll get to the point, Mr. Sawyer. Are you suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder? Your wife assures me that you made no mention of what caused you to damage your leg so badly. What happened to you, Mr. Sawyer? It might help if you were to talk about it. Mr. Sawyer's face went as white as a sheet, as the colour evacuated his skin, as fast as the drained water in a sink. He hadn't expected this confrontation. I noticed his veined hands began to shake, and it was as if his whole bed jiggled under this wobbling momentum. Lisa's eyelashes were quivering under the pressure of the droplets of tears that were gathering and clinging together on her hairs like opaque raindrops. She's right, isn't she, Baron? She's hit the nail on the head, hasn't she? You're hiding something. I can see it in your face as clear as day. Tell us what happened. How did you hurt your leg like this? Mr. Sawyer's face clammed up like a mussel in its shell. His jaw tightened, the muscle on his face clenched, and I detected in his bright green eyes a glint of vulnerability that I had never perceived before. Maybe your husband doesn't want to talk about it now, I told Lisa, but I'm sure when the time is right, he'll tell us what happened to him. Won't you, Mr. Sawyer? Mr. Sawyer did not respond, but remained stiffly silent. His eyes seemed almost glazed, as though he was staring out into space and had left the confines of his bedroom, as if he was reliving an experience in his mind, one that he was not willing to share. Lisa looked at her husband warily. Baron Sawyer, I wish you weren't so goddamned obstinate, intransigent, and downright bull-headed. Shall we get on with these exercises, so that the young filly here can leave? I'm sure she's got lots to do. We're not doing any exercises this morning, Mr. Sawyer, I assured him. We're not, said Mr. Sawyer, unable to disguise his relief. He looked as if the weight of the world had been lifted off his shoulders, as if he could breathe again. But I don't understand. You said... Forget what I said, Mr. Sawyer. I said this sifting through the medications on his side table, making a mental note of the colourful kaleidoscope of meds he was taking, some that I realised should not have been prescribed at all, as they could potentially make things a lot worse for him. I will not be asking you to do any exercises until we get this pain of yours under control. I would, however, like to examine your leg, so that you can tell me where it exactly hurts. I will only be proceeding with your physiotherapy exercises when I'm completely satisfied that we've got you comfortable, and that your pain is being managed efficiently. When I'd finished my examination, I informed the Sawyers that I was going to leave, but I would be back very soon to continue the therapy. Goodbye, filly. This is the best physiotherapy session I've ever had. No exercise. It doesn't get better than that. Enjoy it while it lasts, Mr. Sawyer, because I will be back, I said teasingly. Have a great afternoon. Lisa closed the door of the bedroom behind us. I noticed her bright blue eyes were dancing as she studied me curiously. Where did they get you from? You're like the light at the end of a rainbow, like an angel from heaven. Until you came along, I had no hope, she said, the tears welling up in her eyes. I saw Baron the way he was with you. He even called you filly. He doesn't do that unless he likes someone. It was the way you were with him in there, so perceptive, intuitive, compassionate, discerning. None of the other therapists were like you at all. They didn't care like you do. It was like you could see right through his huge bravado. I knew he was in pain. I knew it. I knew he was hiding something, but you brought it all out into the open. Absolutely everything. I felt it in there. Something shifted. I might just get my husband back. I truly don't know how to thank you enough for what you've already done. You've given us hope. That was more than we could ever have asked for. There's no need for that, I said, giving Lisa a warm, friendly hug. I'm only doing my job. I'm a staunch believer in treating the whole person, not just the visible wounds. Take it from me, Lisa. Something happened to your husband. We know that. When he shattered his leg. Because his fractures are not just physical. They're internal. I mean to get it out of him, I really do. Otherwise, this thing that is eating his insides up will literally consume him alive. I need to get to the bottom of this enigmatic situation. That's why I love my job so much, Lisa. Helping lost people like your husband finding his way back again. For me, it's an honour, a real honour, to help people. And I won't be happy until the healing on the outside is as good on the inside. You're absolutely right, Lily. My husband's never been the same since he injured that leg of his. If our emotions are indeed like internal bones, he's fractured a few, let me tell you. And so it was I began the long gruelling journey of physical therapy procedures with Mr. Sawyer. Slowly but surely, with his pain under control, he began to make phenomenal progress. I could see that this difficult, tumultuous man was just hiding behind an angry facade of self-preservation. But I knew that deep down in his gut, he had a story to tell. But I chose not to pressurize him on this matter until the time was right. And one day my enduring patience most certainly paid off. "Philly," he said, "come and sit down next to me." "Is something troubling you?" I asked him. "In a manner of speaking, yes, I suppose it is. In truth, it's been irking me for a very long time. Remember when you came here, and you were talking about the Vietnam soldiers and post-traumatic stress disorder that they suffered?" "I remember," I said, reaching out for Mr. Sawyer's hand and giving it a big encouraging squeeze. "Yes, I remember. Well, I think that maybe I do have the same condition after all." "I think you have it," I said. "I really do. I've suspected that for a long time." "This is between me and you," he said, lowering his gravelly voice. "I don't want Lisa to hear this. It would upset her far too much." "Go on. Your wife's in the kitchen baking a cake. The coast is clear. Out with it." "Well, like a lot of Alaskans, I'm an avid hunter, Philly. Have been so for many years. Many, many years. Long before you were even born. There's nothing I like better than getting up close and personal to the natural world. There is no place in the world I'd rather live than here in Alaska. For despite everything, amidst all the treacherous hazards of living out here, the beauty of Alaska transfixes your senses. It's prepossessing. The crisp fresh air, the glaciers, mountains, tundra, volcanoes, coastline, lakes, alpine meadows, highway passes. I love it all. Anyway, I was privy to an area of wilderness through a close friend of mine, who assured me was an exceptional all-round treasured spot for hunting that not many Alaskans had cottoned on to yet. A forest area surrounded by alpine meadows, and a large stream that meanders through the valley with a forceful, rambunctious current. So I followed the map that he'd drawn for me, that is, leaving Fairbanks behind. After a long journey, I finally drove down the long, windy, rugged road that was lined with very tight clusters of spruce trees on both sides of it. It overlooked an enchanting mountainous valley, where you could still see patches of white snow drizzling over the mountain like the icing on a rum barber. I pulled my truck to the side of the road, parking on the small embankment. I found a very clear path through this tight, very bushy forest. At first it was laborious, hard-going, walking through this heavily congested space, very overgrown by creepers. But then quite suddenly the scenery changed, as if by magic. The forest opened up generously into wide open paths that were beautifully cleared, and when I say cleared, beautifully cleared. I know it sounds crazy, but as I walked through this space, it was like entering another world. Its resplendent beauty was off the charts, Lily, let me tell you, in its visual aesthetic appeal. If you had told me I'd died and gone to heaven, I would almost certainly have believed you. This place, he sighed, looking at me with a look of wondrous awe on his face, was beguiling, bewitching, spectacular. I've lived in Alaska all my life, Lily, but never, and I repeat, never have I beheld such beauty. It brings to mind the family children's book. What's it called? The Secret Garden. I think the name is Frances Hodgkin Burnett. That's the author. It was just like that. In truth, I felt like an imposter, as if I'd invaded someone's personal space, as everything was pristinely maintained. There was viridescent green everywhere, bluebells, so many of them, dog violets, dog roses, cowslips. They laced the floor in an artist's collage of rich, vibrant colours. If that was not enough, the forest was basked in this ethereal light that was so magical, it took my breath away. It was like the light was almost musical. It was as if it danced, floated, infused the forest. It seemed to highlight the contours of every leaf, every flower, every tree trunk in this golden glaze that glistened, sparkled, twinkled. And that was when I saw a few deer, comfortably frolicking in the woods that was fringed by the large alpine meadow. These deers did not behave in a normal way, Lily. You would have expected a wild animal to behave, that is. They were so tame, so very tame, almost like someone's pets, friendly even, curious, very curious. They weren't the least bit afraid of me. Imagine that, Lily. They weren't afraid of me. I'm almost sure I could have gone up to them, stroked them. They wouldn't have batted an eyelid, I don't think. Are you kidding me? This is Alaska we're talking about. Deer don't behave like that, I insisted. No, I'm not kidding, Lily. Do I look like I'm kidding? The deer, they were docile, gentle, calm, fearless. So you're saying that the deer didn't even flee when they saw you? That's peculiarly strange. I mean, you and your rifle in their eyes surely equals a predator. In my experience, deers always flee a predator. They're naturally skittish. They didn't flee. They watched me curiously with their eyes, as if they were trying to comprehend what I was doing there, almost as if I was the uninvited stranger trespassing on their turf, and they were literally saying, "Who are you?" As you can imagine, I almost certainly didn't want to shoot any of these beautiful deer. I mean, how could I? Not in the circumstances. It would have been wrong. Very wrong. Even I knew that. All of a sudden I heard a tuneful whistle, as if someone was whistling a euphonious song, but not one that I recognised. The sound was very pretty, Lily. Sweet-sounding, mellifluent, musical. That was when I realised that someone was in the woods with me. I could sense a ponderous presence, like you would feel if a huge grizzly bear entered this bedroom now. Even without that whistling, I knew someone was there, or shall we say someone was coming. On my part, I did feel like an intruder in this wooded sanctuary, almost as if I'd broken into someone's house. But I had as much right to be in those woods as any other person living in Alaska. Of course you did, I said encouragingly. Of course you did. I decided to hide behind a spruce tree. I could hear the person coming. For some reason I didn't want to be seen by them, even though I wasn't trespassing, but I felt like I was. I hid behind a tree while a couple of doe with their pretty fawns watched me curiously as they continued to chew their cud. I remember thinking that this man must be a weighty individual. As he neared his approach, the hefty sound of his footfall was thunderous, substantial, hefty. I likened the sound of his walking to an elephant thumping across the ground towards me, but an elephant pounding the ground on 2 feet, not 4, for these were distinctive bipedal footsteps, but very powerful ones at that. I remember thinking this fellow has got to be over 600 pounds or more to make the ground heave and vibrate like that. But then again, you wouldn't think a 600-pound man would have the physical dexterity, capability, or even fitness to be able to navigate his way through such a dreadfully rugged terrain, unless he was a bodybuilder of note, which would then explain his weight. I noticed a couple of the doe with their speckled fawns that had been watching me shifted their gaze towards the approaching stranger. They fearlessly bounded towards him, as though delighted to see him, like an exuberant puppy dog welcoming you home after a long day at work. That was when I saw him. You saw him, I asked. Who was it that you saw? Was there a man living rough in the woods? In a manner of speaking, Philly, I suppose you could say that. A very large man indeed. A Bigfoot, to be exact. A Bigfoot, I gasped. You saw a Bigfoot? What did it look like? I asked excitedly, hardly being able to contain my enthusiasm. Was it like an ape-man? An ape-man? Said Mr. Sawyer, looking at me through his green eyes in surprise. No, he didn't look like an ape-man. But I've heard that Bigfoots are like primates. Well, you heard wrong, Philly. The creature was most certainly all man. But are you sure, then, it was a Bigfoot? Of course I'm sure, Philly. The Bigfoot had the quintessential features often discussed in local reports. The pointed head, the overlong arms, the body swathed in very thick, long, dark hair. But then I suppose it would have to be thick and luxurious like that, given the winter weather here in Alaska, or the creature would never survive. So what makes you say it was human? I asked. The face, Philly, the face. It was so human, unnervingly so. As for the size of this thing, it was humongous. I don't think you can appreciate how huge a Bigfoot is until you see one for your very self. Even a grizzly bear would be intimidated by this thing, possibly scared off by it too, I shouldn't wonder. It was only after I saw this Bigfoot that I realized that this had to be Alaska's most dangerous predator. That big, I gasped. That big, Philly. That big. If you were to guess, how tall was this thing? Oh, easily over 9 foot. Easily 800 pounds or more, but very wide over the shoulder area. Hefty, burly, muscular, powerful, strong, majestic, lofty. I could go on forever. So what did the Bigfoot do? I asked. I watched him squatting on the ground on his haunches, fussing over the deer, as though they were his own pets. He was stroking them like you or I would fuss over our dogs. They were nuzzling him. Oh, they loved this Bigfoot much more than some dogs love their own human owners. And the feeling was mutual, for that Bigfoot loved those deer. I mean, he loved them. Heaven help anyone who hunted down one of his beloved deer. They would almost certainly be on the receiving end of that Bigfoot's wrath. I noticed the deer would go in and out of the woodland area, as they loved to graze in the alpine meadow, and return back to the wooded sanctuary. They were the most peaceful, relaxed deer, chilled out like you can't believe, that I've ever seen. But certainly with that Bigfoot looking after them, I ask you, what the heck did they have to fear? Nothing. I wouldn't mind the Bigfoot having my back. After fussing over the deer, the Bigfoot sniffed the air, and I knew he'd smelt me. I just knew it. You could see his large aquatic nostrils twitching, while his huge pyramid-shaped head swiveled around in my direction, until they were pinned on the very spruce tree where I was hiding, exactly where I was hiding. The expression on his face was far from happy. I've never felt so much fear, Philly, as I did then. I knew I was in grievous danger, real danger. I could smell it, taste it, sense it in the core of my being. I decided to take my chances. I mean, what did I have to lose? I surreptitiously backed away as stealthily as I could, but it was too late. In a second the creature had glided up to me. His breathing was heavy, his deep-set dark eyes fixed on me, studying me intently. His eyes seared through my thoughts as if he was trying to read my mind like the script of an open book. I watched in horror as his discerning eyes travelled up and down my body, as if he was searching me, like one of those detectives at the airport, until they settled on the rifle in my hand. Then his demeanour shifted, as fast as the weather. He became incensed. I could see the creature physically stiffen, his jaws tighten, his breathing intensify. I noticed the large, generous hands began to clench tightly. He then grabbed my rifle, bent it in half like that psychic Uri Geller that bends spoons backwards. It was nothing for him to bend my rifle in half, nothing. He threw it across the forest floor in a frenzied rage, where it must have landed amidst the ground cover there. I think he assumed I was there in the woods trying to hunt down one of his beloved deer. Of course, I was planning to hunt, but not those deer. Not in a month of Sundays. But the look he gave me was venomous, lethal. His demeanour was like a protective father that wants to knock the lights out of you because he believes your intentions towards his beloved daughter are not good. I knew in that moment I was in trouble. Big, big trouble. The creature straightened out his torso, began to beat his chest as if he was lamenting. I watched in horror as his thin black lips on his dark leathery face rolled back to reveal these glistening white teeth. Then the creature growled at me, so aggressively that he would have made a lion's snarl seem like a pussycat. I say that without any exaggeration, Lily. The sound he made was terrifying. Even the needles of the spruce trees began to shake and vibrate. I don't know a time in my life when I was seized or crippled by so much terror. I was certain I was about to die. I wasn't going to get away from that creature in one piece. I knew it, but I would die trying, as what did I have to lose? My feet felt like concrete blocks beneath me as I tried in vain to make my feeble escape, but I was no match for this creature. I tried to bolt away, run as fast as I could, but it was like I was an old car with a faulty engine that could barely start. I was begging for adrenaline to course through my veins, to give me that vital edge, but it eluded me. I was wobbling so much that my legs were beginning to buckle beneath me like a folding camping chair that had lost its stability. I was stumbling over everything, plants, vegetation, tree stumps. My balance was as precarious as a man on one leg. The angry creature lifted me into his arms, tossed me over his shoulder defiantly like a sack of potatoes, glided with me through the woods as fast as he could. He moved like the wind. I remember I couldn't scream, Lily. The lump in my throat was so thick that nothing would come out. I was so afraid, but I was resigned to my plight. The creature was going to kill me, and there was not a whole lot I could do about it. I just hoped with all my heart that it would be a merciful, quick death, and that my body would be recovered, as the last thing I wanted was my wife to have no closure in her life. She doesn't deserve that. I remember as the creature moved with me on his back, he literally floated. His movements were fluid, no jolts or bumps that you get with other animals. I've been a horse rider all my life, but this creature's movements were graceful, effortless, smooth. He smelt of the earth and dust, like our cat Bilbo Bobbins, who spends his life rolling in the dust in the summer months. The Bigfoot smelt like him. He was breathing exactly like a horse, but given his substantial size, and of course the oxygen needed to be transported around his body, I suppose that makes a lot of sense. Finally, he was gliding with me down the embankment on the side of the road, close to where I had been driving my truck earlier. Then he dumped me on the side of a spruce tree, as if he was offloading a large sack of rubbish for the garbage disposal to collect. By this time he wasn't particularly aggressive towards me, but his arms were so powerful, so when I hit the side of the spruce tree, I could hear bones breaking, snapping and fracturing. And the pain, it was unbearable. The creature looked at me, and in my mind I heard the words, "If you dare come near my dear again, I will kill you. I will kill you." He grunted, snorted, turned around, and glided away. Since then I've done some research on Bigfoot, Lily. It seems the indigenous Indians described them as the king of the forests, and there are lots of stories of Bigfoot protecting the deer, killing hunters who shot these animals for sport, but not those who killed them for genuine food. Only those who enjoyed robbing a creature of its life without using its body parts for survival. Those were the ones that the Bigfoot killed. "It's an extraordinary story," I said. "Do you think the Bigfoot wanted to kill you?" "Actually, no, I don't. He wanted me out of that wooded sanctuary, nowhere near his deers. It was his territory. But I think if I'd killed one of his deers, I would almost certainly be dead right now, even as I speak. In fact, I don't doubt it. I know it." "But you're not dead, Mr. Sawyer, are you? You're alive and well. The Bigfoot didn't kill you. He just made his point. He didn't want you going anywhere near his territory. And you were discerning enough to know that the tame deer that you encountered should not be shot. And that revelation saved your life. Well, I'm glad to inform you that when Baron Sawyer began to tell me his story, the post-traumatic stress disorder dissipated as he came to terms with what had happened to him. He told me that the Bigfoot taught him the value of every life form on this planet. He has never been able to kill a deer since this event. I cannot, he told me. I just can't. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Hector, and although I'm a bona fide American, I was actually born in England and grew up in the 80s era. My father was temporarily posted to London for a brief assignment that ended up lasting 12 long years, so invariably the first 10 years of my life was spent in England, until my parents finally returned home to North America, which was where I had my Bigfoot encounter at the young age of 18. I grew up in the English countryside in a quaint English Berkshire village, which was about 10 miles from Windsor, 35 miles from London, 4 miles from Wokingham, and 7 miles from Henley-on-Thames. I grew up in a Grade 2 listed property on over an acre of land, and the picturesque farmhouse was exceedingly old, but had been restored to its original pristine condition. The house itself was very wholesome, with a whimsical fairy tale charm, and was considered an architecture's treasure. It was built from stone, red brick, stucco and wood, and was surrounded by emerald green pristinely manicured lawns, beds of exquisite rambling roses, hollyhocks, larkspur, daisies, beautiful blue delphiniums, and deep red hardy geraniums. There was a scattering of tall tarry oaks, and on one side of the property was an orchard of apple trees. The inside of our home was very sumptuous and cosy, with oak timber floors and beautiful doors with timber beam accents, both on ceilings and walls. There was a grand ornate oak staircase that led to the upper floors of our home, and then there was a huge stone fireplace in virtually every room of the entire house. I had an idyllic childhood playing with the village kids and attending the local school there, while my father commuted to London every day, which was an hour each way from Wokingham to London Waterloo. I remember when I was about 7 or 8 years old, I became very aware that we were not alone in our home, and that was when my first introduction to the paranormal was born. Every night I would hear these airy footsteps quickly pacing up and down our wooden floors at night, and rushing up and down the staircase very quickly in a hurried way, almost as if someone was in a frantic rush. As a kid, it was absolutely terrifying for me to hear these spooky anomalous sounds, and when I began to tell my mother that someone was walking around our home at night, she assured me that old houses were notorious for making strange noises. I was not convinced, because I knew I was hearing very distinct footsteps walking up and down those creaky floorboards. One night I looked up from my bed, as I thought my mother had entered my bedroom. I witnessed my door handle twisting spookishly until finally the door creaked open, making an ominous squeaky sound that scared the living daylights out of me. "Mum, is that you?" I called out uneasily from my bed, but there was no answer. I remember staring at the door and feeling certain that someone invisible or a spectral figure was there watching me. I could sense those ethereal eyes gazing at me. For a while all was very still and quiet, and I could hear the sound of heavy feet walking suddenly across my room to the very side of my bed, where the footsteps suddenly just stopped. I remember I sat there, frozen to the spot, with my hair standing on end, as I felt a very formidable, somewhat menacing presence standing close by my bed, staring at me. Yet I saw absolutely nothing. The air in my room became very icy and cold, and I began to shiver violently. "Who's there?" I called out. "Who's there? Who is there?" But there was no answer, and my voice seemed to echo back to me. After a while the hair-raising footsteps retreated and finally left my bedroom. I watched in horror as my door was quickly closed behind me. Terrified, I ran to my parents' bedroom, crying hysterically. I assured them that someone outer-worldly had entered my bedroom and had been standing over my bed watching me. My parents assured me it was my childlike imagination, and children were very good at creating scary pictures in their heads. I did not believe that for a moment. One night I was awoken up to someone shaking me very hard. At first I thought it was my mother waking me up for school, and I groaned, looking at her through my sleepy eyelids. But it was not my mother that I was observing, but someone else, whom I can only describe as a young woman dressed in 1800s clothes, who looked like a maidservant. "Sir, you must come now," came the disquieted voice. "Your son has fallen off his horse, and he's in a very bad way, sir. I think he may be dead. Come at once." I sat up in alarm as I looked at the earnest face of this young woman, who faded before my eyes and suddenly vanished. For some reason I was not afraid, but more mystified by this evocative, rather gripping experience. Even at such a young age, I was consumed and enthralled by that experience. The event seemed so surreal to me, but I was certain I had seen this ethereal, ghost-like girl, and when I told my mother about what had happened to me, I was surprised that she actually believed me. "I have seen that servant girl too," she told me, "running across our lawn in the middle of the night, looking frantic. I knew she was a ghost because she faded before my very eyes. It was the most spellbinding, transfixing thing that I've ever witnessed," she told me. Finally, I had my mother on board with me because she'd been seeing some curious, unexplained phenomena in our home as well, which meant she was less likely to dismiss me again should I have another supernatural encounter. So as irrational as it sounds, instead of feeling fearful about the strange, unearthly, abnormal events going on in our home, it would seem that my mother and I developed a startling passion and somewhat extraordinary intrigue and fascination for all things outlandish, outer-worldly and paranormal. Before long, my mother began to investigate the history of our home. We were to discover a newspaper article which read the following concerning the previous residents of our home, going back many generations. Mr. Bryce Lockwood was horse riding with his brother George down a Berkshire country lane when George described seeing something so freakish that defies all natural explanation. It was a diabolical monster, he told the papers, standing upright on 2 legs, and it was about 7 foot tall and 3 feet wide, covered in dense, thick black hair. It had a hideously evil, grotesque-looking face, like that of a wolf or a savage dog, and it had very long, full tail, like that of a red fox. My brother and I stared at this demonical creature in utter horror, and it curled back its hideous mouth to expose its very sharp canine teeth, and it growled so viciously at us that the menacing, fiendish sound actually caused the ground beneath us to vibrate. "I have never heard such a chilling, abhorrent sound like that before or since," he explained to the paper. "It sent the fear of God into every fibre of my being. This creature looked like he had surfaced from the fire pit of hell itself, if there is indeed such a place." Upon seeing the creature, the horses bolted in terror, with the creature pursuing us from behind. My brother Bryce's terrified horse literally dashed under a tree, where the lower branches thrashed him off the horse so forcefully that he was plunged to the ground and killed on impact. On returning to the scene, it was discovered that Mr. Bryce's clothes had been shredded off his dead corpse by a very savage wild animal, and there were peculiar deep scratches embedded in his torso that the mortician described as coming from the claws of a very large animal of disproportionate size. These were different to the scratch marks received before death from the tree branches, she explained to the papers. "I've never seen anything like them before. The claws that caused these scratch marks were quite literally like daggers." Could there be any truth to this very strange story, or was Mr. George Lockwood intoxicated from a little too much sherry at the time? Yet, if that were the case, what caused the mysterious scratch marks on Mr. Bryce Lockwood's corpse that has left the mortician, Dr. Powell, baffled and at a loss for words? If Mr. George Bryce's allegations do indeed have merit, is there really a wild beast roaming the Derbyshire countryside that would seem to be not of this world? "Wow," I said to my mother, "I now know why that maidservant was shaking me in the night to wake me up. She thought I was Mr. Bryce Lockwood's father and was waking me up to tell me about the horse-riding accident when George was flung to his death." "That would explain why I saw the servant girl running frantically across the lawn," said my mother. "She was trying to get help after Mr. Bryce's dreadful horse-riding accident. Poor thing. I think we may have been caught up in some kind of a time glitch, where the memory of a traumatic event is played back in our time. I've heard about that sort of thing happening before." It would seem that my mother and I began to become incredibly fascinated by the paranormal, and my mother would leave a recorder on in the house overnight, and the next morning we would pick up strange messages like, "Bryce is dead! It was a monster!" or the horse bolted. Everything that we picked up on our recordings seemed to correlate back to the dreadful accident that killed poor Bryce Lockwood. Finally, it would seem when I was 10 years old, my parents returned home to North America, back to Seattle where they're initially from, and we settled down to life in the city in a stunningly refurbished modernised apartment that overlooked fabulous views of the city and the Space Needle. I attended a local school there, and I began to really enjoy my new life in North America, acquiring many new friends as well as an American accent. Before long, my interest in the paranormal seemed to wane and dissipate as I got caught up in the drudgery of everyday routines, such as after-school football practice and drama lessons. One day I began to hear creepy stories of a ghostly apparition that was seen by 3 different eyewitnesses in a forest in the Washington area, and when I told my mother about the sightings, our intrigue and bubbling passion for the paranormal was reborn. "Let's go to that forest at once," my mother enthused excitedly. "We can camp out there overnight. It'll be fun. And while we're in the area, we can interview some of the eyewitnesses and ask them exactly what they saw." I thought it was a fabulous idea, but my father scoffed at us and told us that our obsessive interest and exuberant enthusiasm for all things unseen bordered on the insane, and we were off our heads to want to go chasing after ghosts. Fast forward to a week or so, my mother and I had spoken to 3 different eyewitnesses who had spotted the apparition of a young woman seen in her nightgown rushing through the woods, but no one knew anything about her, or who she was, or how she died. Yet everyone gave a very poignant, similar account of the sighting that made the eyewitness reports seem very credible. She had long blonde, loose-flowing hair, we were told, fair skin, and wore a long nightgown, and she ran like the wind through the forest. It would seem that something or someone appeared to be terrorising her, as she kept looking behind her as if she was being chased. The expression on her face was one of utter terror. I'll never forget her petrified look. "Did she see you?" I remember asking. "No, she just ran, but I knew she was a ghost because she ran through a solid tree, and then she vanished." It was on a Saturday night when my mother and I hitched our tents up in an open clearing beside a silvery lake on the edge of these dreamy woods, consisting of mature, tall, imposing western hemlocks, Douglas firs, spruce, red alder, and Pacific yew trees. It was a very exquisite location, and I knew that whether my mother or I witnessed the apparition of the young girl or not, at the very least we were in for having a very good time. "Your dad thinks we're both completely potty," my mother giggled, as we barbecued some steaks over the open grill and fire pit. "He says if we hadn't lived in that old house back in England, we wouldn't have become so obsessed by the paranormal." "He's probably right," I admitted. "I mean, after you've seen something like that you can't explain, it does have a way of arousing your curiosity and interest." "You can say that again," said my mother, looking excited. "Oh, I do so hope we see that spooky girl tonight. I wonder what on earth she's running from." "So do I said. "Oh, look," I said, pointing to the distance. "Look over there," I said excitedly. "There's some white-tailed deer over there, gathering at the water's edge to drink. They're so gentle and serene." "They most certainly are," sighed my mother happily. "It's so lovely out here. We should camp more often." That night we set our alarm clocks for about 12 p.m. because all 3 eyewitnesses claimed to have seen the apparition of the young girl in the forest at about 12:20. My mother and I retired to our sleeping bags and fell fast asleep, to the distant howls of coyotes, the chorus of crickets, frogs, and the occasional owl hoot. We were awoken to the sound of our buzzing alarm clocks, going off at about 12 o'clock. My mother woke me up eagerly. "Get up," she said. "We want to make sure we see the ghost of the girl, remember?" My mother was physically so excited that I had to literally calm her down. I think Mother was more of a kid than I was, because she was so flustered and enthusiastic about our nightly excursion of ghost hunting. "Mum, I don't want you to be disappointed if we don't see the ghost," I told her. "You can never guarantee these things." "I know, dear, but it's still so exciting looking for her in the dead of night like this." We put on our headlamps and, armed with our flashlights, a camera and a tape recorder, we ventured into the woods. "Whereabouts do you think the girl was last seen?" my mother asked. Suddenly we could both smell the most hideous odour that you could ever imagine, and it was so vile and repugnant, and smelt like seriously off meat or rotten eggs, and was burning our eyes and causing us to sneeze.
"What the hell is that?" whispered my mother, searching the woods with my spotlight and flashing my torch around to see if I could observe a dead animal, but I could see nothing there.
"Something is watching us," whispered my mother. "Look over there." My mother was pointing towards a tree branch that was moving backwards and forwards, and I could swear I could see a black shadowy form lurking behind the tree. "I think it's a shadow person," I whispered to my mother, "and it seems to be interacting with us." My mother became animated because it would seem we had discovered another ghostly apparition in the woods, and she was absolutely enthused. "Supposing it's the man that was chasing after the ghostly girl," she suggested. "Let's follow it," she urged excitedly. As we moved towards the swaying trees, we suddenly heard the most terrible guttural growl, which was unlike anything I've heard before, and it sent shivers down my spine. I've never felt that afraid before. "It's a demon," whispered my mother in horror. "Let's get away from it. In all my research on ghostly apparitions, a ghost that growls is definitely demonic." As we moved away from the growling demonical being, suddenly we heard the most dreadful sound, like a massive animal charging through the bush, tearing towards us at a thunderous speed, and as it moved, it caused the ground beneath it to shake and vibrate. My mother and I started to run as fast as we could in the opposite direction from our tent, and we stopped for a moment to see if we could see the demonic entity that we thought was chasing us. But what we saw was so strange, for that moment we just stood paralysed and frozen to the spot like vast blocks of ice, immobilised by terror. Standing over 100 yards away from us was the hugest monstrous creature that I've ever seen. I mean, this thing was jumbo in size. It must have easily been 10 foot tall, possibly more, and at the very least 1,000 pounds, and approximately 5 foot wide. Forget these measurements. This thing was hectically huge and powerfully intimidating, and it possessed a very hostile demeanour towards us. It glared and glowered at us with such an intense hatred, loathing and revulsion, a look that I could see emanated fiercely from its aggressive, hostile red eyes. I could tell that it was covered in coal-black long hair, and it was built like an army tank. It was that burly. I noticed that every area of this critter's body literally bulged with muscle that would have intimidated the strongest man in the world, I promise you. My mother and I afterwards were pretty sure that this thing could have easily lifted up a car in its bare hands, as if it was just a toy. There are no words to describe to you the strength, power, and might of this extraordinary creature. I observed that this beast possessed these humongous-sized shoulders, the likes of such I've never ever seen before, and very overlong arms, and powerfully strong, sturdy legs, and a very distinctive cone-shaped head. I could not believe what I was actually seeing. The creature growled at us and rolled back its mouth to reveal very large, jagged, human-like teeth that glistened menacingly under the light of our headlamps, and then it began to make the most gut-wrenching roar that would easily make a lion's roar almost seem like a pussy-cat, and I'm not exaggerating. Even the tree shook under the vibration of this monstrous beast, and especially when it made that raucous, ungodly sound. My mother screamed at the top of her lungs as this thing came charging towards us. He grabbed my mother viciously and threw her to the ground like a baseball, but she got up and tore through the woods as fast as she could, and the creature was running fast behind us. I have never ever encountered such hostility and aggression before, but this creature, if he'd wanted to kill us, he could have done so in a heartbeat. I think he just wanted us off his turf, but let me tell you, I've never encountered such aggression before. Once we'd run through the forest, there was an open road and a farmhouse in the distance, so we ran over there and banged on the front door as hard as we could. We told the kindly farmer that something had chased us through the woods, and we were so terrified and too frightened to go back to our camping spot. We did not want to tell him about the ape-like humanoid in case he thought we were a couple of nutters, but we knew what we saw that night. "You are not the first to be chased out of those woods," said the farmer. "Believe me, I've heard some stories about those woods." He assured us that we were welcome to stay at their home overnight. The next morning he was good enough to accompany us back to our camping site, armed with his hunting rifle for our protection, so that we could gather all our belongings to go home. Imagine our immense surprise when we observed that all our things were scattered absolutely everywhere, all over the clearing, and our tent had been torn to shreds. I remember the farmer was so dumbfounded. He said to us, "Remind me to never hunt in these woods. What the hell did this to your tent?" He was absolutely horrified. Many, many years later, my mother and I learnt about the strange beast that we encountered in the woods was in fact a Bigfoot, and this creature put an end to our ghost hunting expeditions altogether because it frightened the living daylights out of us and put us off ghost hunting for good. My mother believes that the ghostly apparition in the woods may have actually been running away from this horrible monster, but we don't know how long ago she was killed, but it's a very likely scenario or possibility. Anyway, that's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.